I want to start off by saying I really don't consider myself a heavy believer in the paranormal. I feel that a lot of situations can be explained by logical science. There are some things that simply cannot be explained though. There were 3 incidences in my childhood home that I cannot still explain to this day. If someone has experienced anything similar, feel free to give me insight. Let me take you back to when I was younger, perhaps 10 or 11. We lived in a very large old Victorian house, which had 5 floors, very long hallways on each floor, and old wooden flooring. There were always creepy sounds at night, and weird power outages, but that could always be attributed to the age of the house. We liked the house a lot. The first incident happened in the attic. We called it the attic, but in reality, it had a family room, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a guest room. The 3rd floor stairs have a landing that leads to the attic door, which takes you up a flight of stairs, and you come to a long hallway on your left that leads you to the family room at the end of the hall, and a large window on your right that the moonlight comes through. When you enter the family room, there's a spiral staircase that takes you to the top floor, which is just a dark, small room that we never used except for storage. One night, I was playing with my toys on the stairs of the 3rd floor, right next to the door that leads to the attic. We had a cat at the time. As I was playing, I heard scratching in the attic. Not wanting to get in trouble for her destroying a couch, as I'm the one who asked for the cat, I opened the attic door and walked up the stairs to go find her. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the long hallway, the scratching stopped and the power to the house went out, which left me in total darkness. I put my back against the window and slid down, and started down the long hallway, terrified and waiting for the power to come on. As I slid down, I heard a very slow thump, the sound of someone walking down the spiral staircase. The sound is unmistakable because the steps are metal. The sound continued right behind the family room door. I heard each step. The steps stopped. The family room door moved slightly, and immediately I felt this rush come over me. I got so cold, and my heart started beating in such a way, I felt it actually move my chest. After a few seconds, the door bolted open, and something started sprinting down the hallway at me. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt the movement, that feeling you get when something is near you. I remember that was the first time I ever felt like prey. My heart was in my throat, but I screamed as loudly as I could, and as soon as it got close to me, the rush went away, and the cold left my body. My parents ran up the stairs, and after I told them what happened, they went to the breaker box and came up and looked all around but found nothing. But the handle on the family room door was broken, and the window behind me was cracked. It is possible I cracked it when I put my back into it to slide down, but it was cracked at a height that I couldn't reach with my body at the time. The basement was the worst part of the house. It was one of those dreary, unfinished concrete floor basements. It was as large as any 1st floor of a house. I mean truly massive. When you open the door, the short stairs look like you're going into a cellar. And when you come down the stairs, you have to walk for several steps in the dark to find the string of light and pull it. Even then, that light only illuminates the immediate area, not the rest of the basement. There are several lights like this the further you go, each one with a string to pull. To the left is the rest of the basement. It goes all the way back, and then there's a cove tucked to the left where the dogs sleep. It's out of the line of sight. Since there's a small window in the cove, it casts this bluish-black light in the morning and night from the moon. One early morning around 5 a.m. I had to go feed the dogs since my dad was out of town. I hated when it was my turn because the basement always gave me a terrible feeling. I would always call the dogs to meet me at the stairs so that I didn't have to walk down the stairs in the dark alone. I called for them, waited and called again. They didn't come and I heard no sound, so I walked down the stairs in the dark and held my hand out to find the string to pull the light. As I reached for the light, I saw movement at the end of the basement near the cove, and my breath caught in my chest. I pulled the light fast, and the bulb popped with a quick burst of light. In that moment I saw a man standing at the end of the basement. He didn't disappear like in the movies though, and I wish he had. In the dark he was a sliver of moonlight from the cove window. I can still see him standing there with his back to me. He didn't move at all, and his head was cocked to the left in such an unnatural way, at an angle where his neck had to have been broken. He was probably 40 feet away from me. As I stood there trying to force a scream through my throat that felt like it was locked up, I couldn't look away. And in those few seconds I stared, I saw it. It was less of a man and more of a thing. It had white translucent skin and looked gangly. I literally and honestly pissed myself standing up. I lost all control. I think the pee snapped out of me because I felt the warmth of my leg, and I started backing away. And as I backed away, it sprinted to the left towards the cove where the dogs were, and I ran up those stairs, and I chipped my tooth falling into the stairs, still chipped to this day, and I slammed the door shut and locked the latch. I called my mum down, and we called the dogs from the top of the stairs. No response. We went down there, and both dogs were huddled together in the corner of the cove. It took them 5 minutes to leave the corner and come up. We had to pull them apart and walk them with us holding their collars. The last one is short and simple, and probably the worst experience I had in that house. In that same basement, there's a furnace room to the left of the stairs about 15 feet away from the stairs. It's dark and cramped, and has all kinds of luggage and extra supplies in it. The day before Thanksgiving, we were preparing for family to arrive. My mother sent me to get the Thanksgiving table decor, or whatever it's called, and as I walked down the stairs I saw the furnace room door was cracked. I stopped dead in my tracks. That door was never left open. We were always told to close it so that the dogs don't go in there. Really, my parents made a huge deal out of it, and I stayed on the stairs and stared at the door. I felt the hair on my neck raise, and my fists clench out of instinct. As I stare in the crack of the door, I see half a smile in one eye. The smile was so close to being human, but so far at the same time. I can't explain it. It was as though something had been observing humans to mimic them, but just couldn't get the face right. As I ran up the stairs, I heard the creak of the furnace door opening further, slammed, and locked the door. And that was the last time I ever went into the basement. From that point on, my parents never made me go back down there and delegated my basement chores to my siblings, even though I know that they don't believe me. It was a nice gesture, and I was thankful for it. Since we moved, I have never experienced anything abnormal in our house. I'm 26 now, and have never had any issues with the paranormal since then. I like to rationalize by telling myself it was fear and my brain playing tricks on me. But part of me deep down knows that it wasn't. In the late 90s, I worked as an au pair, a sort of nanny, for a girl called Amy, who was around 11 at the time. I also did light cleaning around the house and often cooked. The layout of the house was such that the second floor where I slept was half the length of the first floor and ended in a balcony overlooking the living room. A staircase ran down the wall and had no rail to prevent one from falling into the hardwood floor. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs. The one I lived in was square and had 1 bed and a window overlooking the horse pastures and 2 barns. The other room was small and rectangular, with the ceiling coming in on either side. The walls, curtains and bedclothes were white, giving it a look of a room in an old mental asylum. It had 2 single beds, one against each wall, and a window that looked out onto the driveway and garage. Through that window you could see into the window of the room above the garage, which had been an apartment but was used for storage at that point. There was a woman who would appear at the end of the upstairs hall, or at the door, or inside the unoccupied room. Only the top half of her body though, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, wearing a dress that appeared to be Victorian in style. She was always accompanied by feelings of intense anger and malice. Even when she didn't appear, she could sometimes be felt. It wouldn't have been so bad if she didn't push people down the stairs. It happened to me. I felt her whoosh up behind me and then cold hands on my back shoving me forwards, but I managed to turn towards the wall and save myself. Amy and her friends often went down these stairs bumping along on their bottoms. A farmhand came in to use the bathroom one day. They normally went to the one downstairs, but it was occupied, so I told him to go up and use mine. I was sitting at the kitchen table, where I could see the stairs. As he came back down, I saw him jolt forward and almost fall. He turned around in surprise and looked behind him. "Did she get you?" I asked. He never came back to the farm. One day the owner asked me to help get some things from a storage area next to the room with 2 beds. There was a small access door in the wall on the left side of the room, as you'd come in the door. When it was opened, the room seemed to get colder. I had to crawl inside since I was more flexible. The room was larger and longer than it seemed like it would be from the outside, and looked as though it had originally been part of the bedroom before a wall had been added to close it off. There was a child's plastic table and a chair set up near the door, with plastic teacups and plates and an old rocking horse. I had to move the rocking horse out of the bedroom to get to the boxes I needed. When I touched the rocking horse, I got a strong image of a girl riding it, with the woman in black watching over her, lips pursed in her everlasting stern expression. When I crawled out with the boxes, I made a comment that Amy must have played in the room when she was little. The owner shook her head. They only had moved into the house a few years ago. The toys had all been there already. We left the rocking horse out in the room since we thought it was pretty and would be nice for decor. That night though, I could hear it. The soft, rhythmic creaking and sliding of the rocking horse slowly working its way across the floor. The next morning, the owner silently took the rocking horse out of the house. The room with 2 beds was right over her bedroom. Then one day, a previous au pair and her mother were traveling through the area and needed a place to sleep and take a break. The mother, of course, got the room I had been sleeping in and took a change of clothes and my personal belongings into the room with 2 beds. The other au pair, Mary, had a fair bit in common with me, and we started chatting. Mary said she was relieved I was sleeping in the room with her, since she'd originally had this room when she was working for the family. During that time, she'd heard strange sounds, had the covers pulled off her, the bed shaken, and had seen the woman in black standing at the door staring at her angrily. Around 3 a.m, I woke up when the covers were pulled down. I grabbed them and yanked them back up, and they were pulled down again. I hissed at whatever it was to quit. I was settling down to try and sleep again when I felt something in the room through my closed eyes. I opened my eyes and looked over towards the window. I could see the lady in black standing there, looking out through the window. I didn't dare move. I closed my eyes again and hoped she'd go away. I felt her energy depart, and when I opened my eyes, she was gone. I couldn't help but wonder what she'd been looking at, though. That's when I looked over to the window and looked out. The light over the parking area shone into the window of the room above the garage. I could see the rocking horse, rocking itself slowly across the floor. I went back to bed, but didn't fall asleep. They put the house up for sale a few months later, and it has since been demolished. The area is a sports and recreational area now. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was an extremely normal occurrence to see all sorts of lights move across the sky. Keep in mind the winter is long in the Arctic, which means longer amount of time being spent under the stars. It's quite beautiful, as long as you don't mind the cold so much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it down and just lay down on the snow looking up at the majesty of it all. The only thing disturbing the silence being the occasional breeze. The northern lights are also a common occurrence. It doesn't happen every day, but often enough that they start getting ignored after a while, as long as they aren't too spectacular anyway. On one night in particular, without asking my parents, as it was their snowmobile, I decided to go on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town, shut off the machine, and settled into a good spot to look up and be retrospective. It wasn't all that interesting of a scene, a few satellites passing here and there, some relatively boring, actively affecting the magnetic field, and that's when I started noting a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snow machine cooling down, as the engine expands and contracts a lot in the cold, but the source of the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. My next thought was there must be an animal nearby, in which case I needed to get out of there fast. You don't really want to mess with a wild animal, but the clicking is far too regular for an animal to produce it. It was fairly mechanical sounding, and again the source of the sound wasn't coming from anywhere around me, laterally. It was coming from up, so naturally I look up determined to ascertain the origin of this strange noise. I see what I always see: stars, northern lights, and some lazy satellites floating across the sky, all normal stuff. But before I dismiss it altogether and begin heading home, I noticed something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 rather strong points of light. I ignored them at first, thinking they were oddly symmetrical stars, but this proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring with morbid fascination as they grew stronger and stronger, yet still, only remaining single points in the sky. All the while the clicking noise is getting louder and louder and more pronounced, almost like someone started with tapping a pen on a desk and clacking billiard balls together inside my head. Then it stops, the lights are gone, the clicking is not heard, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and rather petrified, I'm fine. So I jump back on the snowmobile, thinking perhaps I'm going crazy. The machine takes a little longer to start up than usual, and I am beginning to worry. But soon it's running and I'm heading back to my town. As I'm driving back, several plausible scenarios as to what occurred are running through my head. I'm thinking it could have been a helicopter from the mine or some strange northern light behavior, etc. Probably not that big of a deal. I pull up to my house, lights are all dark, strange. It wasn't like that when I left. I open the outer doors as quietly as possible, remove my winter gear and enter the inner door. The house is quiet, really quiet. My parents are teachers and are usually up late marking or watching TV. All I'm thinking is I have to get to bed without anyone noticing. Proves to be easy as I'm soon under my covers and go set my alarm for the next day. When all of a sudden everything made sense. Engine hard to start, stiff, rather chilly, nobody up when I was gone for what felt like a relatively short period of time. It was almost 11 p.m. when I left, and now it was creeping up to 6 a.m. I stood, staring at clicking lights for almost 7 hours. I never ended up sleeping that night, and I don't go on late-night snow machine rides anymore. As a child, my parents always introduced me to everyone that ever came to our house. I was taught to shake my hand with them and say, "Hi, my name's Anthony, what's yours?" This was a rule that could not be broken. One night, when I was 7 or 8, I had a bad dream about being old. I went out to the living room to talk to my dad, who always used to play Legos with me when I had a bad dream. This time, when we got the Legos, there was a man in a chair. I went to introduce myself, and to my surprise, Dad shooed me away, got out my Legos, and proceeded to talk to the man instead of play with me. The man and my father talked for some time about things I didn't understand, and didn't say a word to me. It was weird, but I was young and the Legos were fun, and eventually I forgot the whole thing and went to bed. Never thought about it again. Fast forward 12 years. I head to bed one night after having a beer with one or two of my friends, and immediately start, from what I can tell, lucid dreaming. I've never had a lucid dream this vivid since or before. In the dream, I'm sitting in a chair talking to my dad about what I've done with my life. He is happier than usual and very interested. In the distance, I hear a young person calling for him. He gets up, walks out the room, and returns a minute later with a child and a box of Legos. Young me approaches me. My dad shoos the child away. Young me goes to play with Legos, and my dad and I commence talking about the dangers of the butterfly effect and how everything could change if we spoke. He insists we wait until young me falls asleep to continue talking about the future. I have two more similar dreams where I see myself from perspectives of mysterious forgotten people and situations, all with my father, all discussing time travel, my future life, and the consequences of changing things. I woke up absolutely convinced I had time traveled. That, or the ghost of Christmas past, decided he wanted to take an off-season shift. It took me a week to realize it, and still gives me the willies just thinking about it. This happened in the early 2000s, back when my sister-in-law Aspen was a firefighter working with a hotshot crew of about 20 members. The team was arranged to work at an Arizona fire near the New Mexico and Mexico border. The location was very isolated, even more deserted without many people around because of the fire danger. The fire crew had arrangements to stay at the Gadsden Hotel. This happened in the early 2000s, before everyone and their cousins had cell phones, so Aspen had zero clue about the history of this hotel that had been around since 1907. You get orders to go to a location, and you stayed at said location until further notice. When the team got to the hotel, everyone was assigned their rooms. The superiors got private accommodation, and everyone else had a roommate. Aspen was the only female crew member on the assignment, so she got her own. The job was to wake up and go to work for 10 to 16 hours. Rare but not entirely uncommon, you'd work 24 hours. By the time you got off shift, you'd go back to your room to shower, eat, sleep, and then you'd be back on shift. If you had the energy, you'd sit and socialize with the other crew members between shifts. Aspen worked with the crew's squad leader and chief for about 3.5 years, so she'd take time to converse before going to bed. The first 4 days went as normal. Then by the middle of the first week came the stories. These occurrences were acknowledged, and the crew were cautiously wary about their sudden insecurity with the environment. A quick-moving black shadow, seen in rooms and dark corners, or even unseen presences, felt standing near to you. Personal items began to move. The hotel being haunted wasn't yet mentioned. The 5th night, Aspen had done her regular routine. At the end of the day, she got into bed for a night's sleep, and all was peaceful. All that was interrupted when Aspen woke up feeling a weight on top of her, and then felt her throat being gripped. She couldn't breathe. She struggled to move. She couldn't feel her fingers. Her legs flailed under the covers, but her upper torso and arms were pinned by nothing she could see. Yes, it was dark, but with the moonlight through the current, it was faint enough to see some. And there was nothing. 10, maybe 15 seconds of this felt like minutes. Whatever it was suddenly released her. Looking at the clock, Aspen had only been in bed for about half hour. When it let go, she immediately sat up, burst out crying, and flew from her bed and turned on all the lights in the room. She stayed up all night and started her shift exhausted. Aspen stayed up as long as she could for the next 3 days, taking on extra hours and spending as much time as she could doing chores on the trucks away from their hotel room. When she did manage to sleep, she kept all the lights on in her room and slept only during the 4 to 5 hours before her shift. On the 8th day, Aspen stopped in the doorway of a crew member where 3 others were hanging out, just chatting and talking about progress being made and the past few days of being on duty. Mid-conversation, a toiletry bag was flung from the TV stand to the middle of the room in front of 3 other people. Everyone kind of laughed uncomfortably. This place is weird. Aspen went to her room. She said that night was the worst night she had ever experienced during her stay in the hotel. The air was heavy and had an aggressive tension to it. She stood in the center of the room, afraid to go to bed. But she was so tired she had to sleep. As usual, she flicked on every light in her room, turned on the television, showered, and then laid down in bed. Fighting sleep, she tried to stay up as long as she could, but lost. Next thing she knew, she felt the bed jolt, like someone kicked or shook it from the corner. She opened her eyes to a completely black room. Every light that she had turned on had been switched off. Launching herself from the bed, she ran across the room and turned on the main light. The first thing she noticed was the TV remote. It was on the table, but she had had it in her hand while laying in bed. Startled and looking up across the room, she saw on the wall a very, very large, black and dark silhouette of a man, standing 6 foot tall, in a dominant stance with a cowboy hat. No one else was in the room. There was nothing else there to cast a shadow. Aspen screamed, ran out of her room crying, and ran down the hall to her crew chief. She started banging on his door. "Anders, let me in!" She was hysterical. He opened the door confused and concerned, and Aspen immediately began pleading her case with a sudden outburst. "I can't sleep in there. I won't. Give me the rig keys, I'll sleep in the truck. That shadow thing in my room, it won't let me sleep." Keep in mind she's crying and talking, and the commotion had woken up Chief Warren, the second in command, and his roommate Carson, who both came to see what was happening. Anders was trying to make sense of her story. She got to sit down and calmly say it again. "There's something in my room. I won't sleep there." That is the final version of what Aspen explained to her crewmates. "Anders, I'll just sleep in the truck tonight." Anders, Carlson, and Warren simultaneously said no. "We're basically on the Mexico border in the middle of the desert. You're not sleeping in the rig," was their conclusion. Carson went and collected Aspen's personal belongings from the room, and she spent the night sleeping on the couch in the captain's room. She even called his wife to explain the situation, and she was very nice about it. Aspen said the rest of her stay was peaceful and nothing bothered her for the rest of the assignment. They were there for only 2 more days after the incident. No one doubted her experience or made her feel crazy about it. The crew members who witnessed Aspen's ordeal agreed that the hotel was weird, and let it be at that. When the checkout came, Aspen waited by the staircase landing, and there near the banister was the guest book. She started flipping through the pages, and there were the history highlights of the Gadsden. After the newspaper clippings and old printouts of the hotel story, there were stories of other people's experiences. People that had things thrown at them, hair being pulled late in the night, the shadow of a cowboy, a headless ghost, phantom knocking and footsteps. Later on, after feeling better, and that there were other people who had the same experiences, Aspen realized that most of the accounts had been written by women. From the time I was born until I was around 6 years old, my family and I lived in a townhome close to my city's community college. It wasn't particularly old, and as far as my parents knew, the house had no dark past to speak of. There was a good chance the house was built on old farmland, and there was certainly a Native American presence in the area long ago. But the house itself was totally normal. My parents moved into the house in 2001 and hadn't had anything out of the ordinary occur until I was born, sometime around late 2004 to early 2005. This is the first odd experience my family had in the house, as told to me by my mum. My mum was very close friends with her supervisor, Christy, Christy was over at our house quite often, since my mum often consulted her for help with work, and she would usually bring her son over to play with me. On this particular day, it was just her. My mum and Christy were down in the kitchen talking at the table. My dad was upstairs in one of the bedrooms changing my diaper. My mum goes up to use the bathroom, which was just across the hall from the kitchen by the front door, and Christy stays at the table. As my mum is in the bathroom, out of nowhere she hears a woman's voice she doesn't recognize, saying something along the lines of, "Hello, handsome." My mum, thinking a neighbor has come over to say hello, thinks nothing of it, and when she comes out of the bathroom, she asks Christy if anyone's come over. Christy looks at my mum baffled and tells her that no one has entered the house and that she hadn't heard a woman's voice. As Christy and my mum look around the house puzzled, my dad comes downstairs holding me and asks, "Who stopped by to say hello?" He'd heard the same woman's voice. No one could figure out where the voice had come from, or how both my mum and dad, on 2 separate floors at the time, had both heard the same voice. Christy told my mum she got a weird feeling in the house, but my parents just wrote it off and figured it was just a strange coincidence. This proved to only be the beginning. It was around this time that my mum began capturing these strange balls of light in every picture she took around the house. Now my mum acknowledges herself that capturing a picture or two containing an orb is nothing out of the ordinary, considering orbs can be caused by dust or tricks of the light. But this was different. These orbs were appearing in every picture she would take. My mum cut the camera strap off her camera, tried using disposable Kodak cameras instead of our digital one, and got the house deep cleaned several times, took pictures in different parts of the house to avoid light contamination, and even bought an entirely new digital camera. But alas, the orbs still appeared in every single photo. There are hundreds of photos sitting in albums in our living room with these massive orbs in them. These orbs will show up later in the story. My mum hosted a group of mothers for young babies at our house, and Christy also happened to be a part of this group. One day the group was over at the house and seated in a circle in our living room, when suddenly Christy looked up towards our couch and screamed, pointing towards it. She looked at my mum in a panic and shouts, "There's a man standing behind your couch!" The rest of the group looked over to see no one. It wouldn't have been possible for there to be someone behind the couch anyway. The couch was pushed up against the wall. Christy grabbed her son and ran out of the house. And although she and my mum remained friends, they haven't seen each other in years, but they're still friends on Facebook, Christy refused to enter the house ever again. Christy had seen the pictures containing the orbs, since they were actually pictures of me and her son together that showed the orbs floating around us. But seeing this man behind the couch was the last straw. She stuck to her word and never returned to the house for the remainder of our time there. It was around this time that my parents began to feel off in the house, especially when spending time in the basement and in my bedroom. My mum would try as hard as she could to avoid spending too much time in the basement, and both of my parents have told me that they feel like they were being watched as they tucked me into bed some nights. And then one day, the activity presented itself while my dad was at work. For a little backstory, I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this as a child, but I was absolutely obsessed with these classical music CDs called Baby Einstein. They had these weird puppet creatures that represented different artists and composers, and all of the CDs were narrated by the same woman, whose name escapes me now. Anyway, I was in the living room asleep while my mum was in the kitchen cooking. She was playing one of the Baby Einstein CDs over some speakers that we had, so that I wouldn't wake up and bother her as she cooked. As she was cooking, she starts hearing what sounds like a woman talking over the music. My mum could tell it wasn't the narrator, since this woman sounded a lot younger and was talking during one of the pieces, and the narrator only came on between songs. At first, my mum thought she could have just been overhearing someone talking outside, And although my mum couldn't make out exactly what the woman was saying, she described it to me as if hearing the woman having a conversation. She sounded happy, and my mum could hear the tone of her voice changing as she talked. When my mum looked out the blinds of the kitchen window, she saw no one. Thinking maybe it was coming from elsewhere, she walked out onto the deck looking out into the forest behind my house. Again, there was no one. At this point, the woman had stopped talking, and my mum was beginning to be convinced that she was experiencing something paranormal. After this, the activity around the house came to a head. There was one night my aunt was over with my mum, helping her around the house while my dad was at work. Another quick bit of backstory. My room was very dark, and it was sometimes very hard to hear what was going on up there from downstairs. For this reason, my parents bought a baby monitor to stick in my room, so they would know if I was crying or wasn't sleeping well. This was long before the days of video monitors, so all this monitor had was a cheap microphone and some red lights that showed how loud the noise was. Also in my room, sitting directly across from the crib, was an old rocking chair that my mum had inherited from her grandma. My aunt and my mum had just put me to sleep, and were sitting downstairs when they started hearing a noise over the baby monitor. At first they couldn't quite make it out, but very quickly realized what they were hearing. It was the sound of the rocking chair, creaking back and forth as if someone was sitting on it. The only person that should have been upstairs at the time was myself, but I was fast asleep. My aunt and mum were downstairs, and my dad was still at work. The two stood up from their chairs in a panic, but as soon as they stood, the creaking noise suddenly stopped. They walked upstairs and into my room and found nothing out of the ordinary. I was still fast asleep, and the rocking chair looked as though it had never been disturbed. They walked back downstairs, and as soon as they sat back down, the creaking started again. This cycle of creaking over the baby monitor, walking upstairs to find everything undisturbed, and then sitting back down and hearing the creak starting again, continued for an hour, and it reached a point where my aunt was convinced we should leave the house and stay in a hotel for the night. Not too long after, my dad came home, and the creaking stopped completely. At this point, my mum was convinced her and my dad's feeling of discomfort surrounding my bedroom were justified, and began looking for ways to solve the problem. Although my dad remained skeptical, my mum was convinced that what was going on in the house was indeed paranormal, and began trying to find ways to reach out to whatever was inhabiting the house with us. At this point, my mum had accumulated hundreds of pictures containing orbs, and wanted to see if she could capture something more compelling in a photo. One day she decided to take the camera and point it to a random spot in the house. Before snapping the picture, she said out loud, "Can you give me some sort of sign that you're here?" She snapped at the photo, and as she looked down at the screen, she was shocked. Several separate balls of light appear in the center of the screen up against a wall, but they appeared in a straight horizontal line. She was ecstatic that not only did she capture something more compelling than an orb, but also managed to capture some sort of intelligence from what she was now convinced was a spirit living in our home. She tried asking for more signs, but in the absence of anything else, she began combing through the hundreds of pictures she'd already taken, looking for anything else that could show these were more than just a trick of the eye, or dust particles floating through the air. After a good amount of time searching, she found what she was looking for. A picture of me and Christy's son featuring an orb. But this orb was different. Inside the orb was an outline of what appeared to be a sort of face. She immediately began searching around the internet for paranormal investigators and contacted a team in the area to see if they would be willing to come and check out the house. The investigators asked her to tell them about the experiences we'd been having in the house, and although they were a little apprehensive, they finally agreed to check things out. Before coming out to investigate, the investigators told her that normally they would not be willing to come and check out a house if all the residents had to show for the ghost were pictures of orbs and personal testimony, but they were convinced by both the sheer amount of pictures that my mum had and the two very bizarre photos, one featuring the line of orbs and the other featuring the orb with a face. The investigators did come over, albeit slightly skeptical, but immediately began experiencing strange activity. Almost as soon as the investigators walked upstairs into my room, all of their camera batteries died simultaneously. This actually freaked them out, with one of them looking at my dad and saying something like, "Your house is weird, man." These were all new batteries, and they died in 5 minutes. The same thing happened down in the basement, with batteries dying left and right, affecting all sorts of equipment. Microphones and digital recorders picked up strange, staticky feedback, and their electromagnetic field readers picked up odd spikes both in my bedroom and in the basement. My parents' suspicions about the house had been confirmed by professionals, and the investigators were convinced there was something off about the house. After reviewing the evidence and doing some deliberating, the investigators told my parents that they wanted to return to the house a second time, this time with more equipment, since they were convinced there was more evidence to be captured. My parents eagerly set up the follow-up and waited. Now this is where the story becomes a little muddy. I do 100% believe my mum, and the fact that my dad, a skeptic, backs her up on a lot of these stories makes it extra compelling to me. But this last part of the story has always left a bad taste in my mouth. My mum has always been a very spiritual person, always believed in angels, certain stones carrying supernatural powers and the like. She's a therapist and a hypnotist, so I get it. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is to maybe take this final portion of the story with a grain of salt. Yes, it's odd, but I don't want to make assumptions about what was going on, and neither should you. I wouldn't be telling this story if I wasn't convinced it was real. But this final portion has always seemed a little odd. So my mum had set up a consultation with a woman claiming to be a psychic medium, well before the paranormal investigators came over to visit the house. The appointment was only a week or so before the investigators were scheduled for their follow-up. Anyway, during the appointment, the woman asked my mum about the strange experiences we'd been having in the house, and the medium told my mum that she'd picked up on the energy of a man in the house. She said he was lonely, and that he'd latched onto my family since he'd never had one of his own. Obviously that didn't explain the woman's voice we heard in the house, but whatever. Like I said, this whole thing seems a little odd to me. The woman asked my mum if she wanted her to either cleanse the house or leave it be. Knowing the investigators were returning soon, my mum told the woman not to do anything to the house. She wanted to see what could be captured with more advanced equipment. The medium told her she wouldn't, but when my mum returned home afterwards, she noticed the entire house felt different. It felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off the house's atmosphere. She began to suspect that the medium had cleansed the house anyway. Not sure how this is possible, considering the medium never actually visited the house. Maybe someone in the comments can explain how this works. Anyway, and her suspicions were only confirmed when the investigators returned for the second time and captured absolutely nothing. No bizarre EMF readings, no cold spots, no electrical malfunctions, not a thing. After the investigators' return, that was it for the specific flurry of activity. There was a second time we had some weird experiences in the house, which I was actually old enough to remember. But in any case, I don't think they're worth mentioning. In conclusion, I'll say I totally believe the things that my parents told me about the house, partly because there were other witnesses to it, and partly because I witnessed some of the stuff myself years later, and partially because my dad can't explain what was going on, and he was and still is a total skeptic. For him to admit not only that he couldn't explain some of the experiences, but also that it genuinely creeped him out sometimes, has me really convinced there was something very strange going on in that house. I know, the whole thing with the psychic medium is odd, but my mum would have no reason to lie about it. She got no attention from local newspaper or TV stations in regard to the activity. The paranormal investigators weren't paying to come over to the house, and my mum has always been apprehensive about sharing the story with others. In fact, this is my first time sharing it. I'm not trying to force anyone to believe it, I'm just saying it how it is. My dad's house is definitely what you would think of as haunted. The whole place has since had a nasty vibe, even when you're simply in another room with nobody else there, and it's unbearable on your own. This experience happened to me when I was a teenager, and it was my first one. What I find interesting is that it was just a completely normal night. I hadn't been spooking myself out with movies, games, or stories. I was just chilling out with my dad in the back room. Next to the back room is the front room, in which there is a door in the corner which leads immediately to the staircase. The front room was completely empty at the time. I was just playing on my computer next to my dad when I heard my mom call me from upstairs, where she was tucking my toddler sister into bed. I got up from my chair, opened the door into the front room, and took a step inside. What happened then is difficult to describe. It was like I'd been separated from the rest of the house. I can't remember if the light was on or off, but it was bright enough to get a clear image of what I saw. In the corner, blocking my way to the stairs, was a female figure. She was sitting with her arms folded around her knees, and her forehead on her knees, blocking her face. She looked filthy, with matted dark brown hair, and her skin looked mottled. She was wearing one of those light blue hospital gowns with the dashed pattern. I couldn't tell her age. I froze in my step and took in the sight. It was so real. She wasn't at all transparent or made of smoke or anything like that. She was completely solid, and the light fell on her as if it would any real person. The worst part was that there was this most evil, malicious, deadly feeling of primal finality emanating from this thing. Her face was hidden, but I could tell she was smiling. I knew she was grinning at me like I was a mouse in a trap. I took a few more steps forwards to get a closer look, until I felt like that if I took one more step, it would be the end of me. I didn't know how long I stood staring. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. Eventually my body and mind started working together again, and I sprinted out of the room screaming. My dad was trying to figure out what was wrong, but I was incoherent. I heard my mum stampeding down the stairs, and when she came I started getting angrier at her, thinking she had somehow pranked me. I don't think my brain could handle what I saw, so I began trying to rationalize it in possible ways. I feel like I saw something that I shouldn't have, or that the thing showed itself to me on purpose. Ever since then, I've always felt her presence in the house, and general activity increased. As though seeing one thing opened the door to many other experiences. The dogs always stare, bark, growl, and raise their hackles at that exact corner whenever we use the room in the winter. I would like to note that I've never hallucinated in waking before or after. I've had sleep paralysis a few times later on, but it was a completely different experience. I wish I could believe it was just a hallucination. I've had people tell me that the story sounds cliché because she was in a hospital gown, but I'm not going to change what actually happened to make it more original nor believable. This has haunted me for years, and I doubt I'll ever forget it. Or the other experiences I've had, including some with witnesses. I really wish I could just forget though, because even now in my mid-20s, I still feel the fear when I'm alone in the dark. I know there are things out there that science doesn't have a means to explain yet, and I'd imagine that this is one of them. This is my dad's story, and he shared it with me when I was about 10 or 11. When he was around 22, he was out of town visiting some friends around 30 miles from where his parents lived. Being the kind of person who was a clean freak, he hated having stubble and a beard of any kind. So he called his parents from his friend's house phone and said he'd be back in around 45 minutes or so, and then hung up. Now, he said that the faster route was on a country road that skipped out any major dual carriageways, and after around 20 minutes of driving and around 5 minutes after getting onto this country road, he said he saw an incredibly bright white light and thought it was a broken down car in a side road. He got out of the car and investigated, but the white light promptly got brighter, then vanished. At this point, he was crapping himself, so he jumped back in his car and concentrated on the road ahead, and finally got home. As he got into the driveway of his parents' house, they ran outside to him crying and hugging him as he was getting out of the car. Being incredibly confused, he asked them what happened. They told him that after he called them, they were waiting for him to get home, but he didn't get home that night. Apparently, it had been 3 days since his phone call. After calming down and calming his parents down, he went to his bedroom and glanced at himself in the mirror. As he walked past it, he had a freaking stubbly beard on the go. To this very day, no one knows what happened that night, and his family hate talking about it. 4 or 5 years ago, I worked at a Little Caesars Pizza. Usually I would work inside on the pizzas, but we had just started up this Monday Madness deal where pizzas were only $4 on Monday, so we needed someone to advertise this great deal. I was a wild and weird metalhead, so I took up the position on Mondays of just going out there throwing around a sign to get attention and bring people in for delicious pizza. Not exactly glamorous, but I had fun. One day while I was out there doing my thing, I see a van coming straight at me. It jumps the curb and slams into me, and I feel it crush against me and the electrical box controlling the streetlight. I see a quick flash as the traffic light flicks off and then black out. I gasp, and I'm still on the corner and nothing has happened, no van or anything. Well, I was a little shaken, so I decide to pack up and walk back to the store for a break. I walk no more than 15 feet from the corner when I hear a crash. I look back, and a van just hopped the curb into the electrical box, and I watched the traffic light flick off. Needless to say, I took the day off. Still think about it from time to time. I used to work in the hotel industry and left the profession for a year due to my course at university getting quite difficult for a few semesters. I came back to it to do some part-time work manning the front desk on a Friday and Saturday night as a night auditor. A few things of how the hotel was built was that there was a car park level directly above the reception and main entrance area. Guests could only access it after calling the front desk, and you would have to manually walk through the car park to open the gated entrance. No one else had access to it, except front desk. I was going through the whole on-the-job training when the receptionist who was training me told me some stories about the hotel, including all the suicides they'd had. What was told to me was that on his watch, he'd had 3, where people had jumped off the balcony or fallen and landed in the car park. What I can't forget, and has stuck to me, was how he described the noise of them landing in the car park level. He said it sounded like a bomb had gone off, and the whole reception area would shake for a few seconds. He then told me about the incidents of staff, especially porters, seeing shadows and people in their rearview mirror when moving the cars around to make more rooms for other cars. There was one story when someone, who had newly started working at the hotel, was called on by a guest to grab something out of the car for him to bring up to his room. He had only gone up to the car park level for a few minutes when other staff, housekeeping, heard screaming coming from that level and someone running down the stairwell trying to frantically open the door to the main foyer. Luckily, there weren't any guests checking in at that very moment, as he had collapsed on the floor screaming that he saw someone walk up to the car and peer into the window while he was searching for whatever the guest had asked him to grab, and when he looked up, he was gone. My girlfriend lives with her grandparents. Her great-grandmother used to live there too, until she passed away in the very room that is now my girlfriend's room. In her will, she left many of her antique items such as her drawers and cabinets. They were very close. A strange thing to mention here is that before she passed away, she told her son, my girlfriend's granddad, who also lives there, that when his time comes, she will take him. In French, it's c'est moi qui viendra te chercher. We live in Quebec. Anyway, for the sake of me telling the story, let's call him Roger. Roger's health had been declining quickly over the past 2 years. As a non-stop smoker who eats overly salty foods and refuses to go to the hospital even for a checkup, you can understand our slight concern. When I first noticed unusual activity in that house, it was minor things. Doors that were left open when they were closed, kitchen drawers that would randomly be opened, the TV would randomly turn on and off, etc. However, as Roger's health deteriorates, the activity in the home is becoming seriously unsettling. For example, one night, her grandparents were going to some camp thing with their friends, so it was just her and I. Her room is in the basement, which is under the living room upstairs. When at about 1 a.m., all we hear and feel is strong footsteps walking around the living room. First of all, the idea of ghosts or anything like that do not cross our mind at the moment, and we were watching Lucifer on TV, so weren't sleeping. And an idea crossed our mind. The only thing you can think of, or at least that we thought, was that there was an intruder in the house. I may be a man and physically fit, but my heart fell to my stomach. I told her to get on the phone and dial 911 while I peeked outside the room and yelled out if someone was there and what they wanted. But I heard nothing, and there was no answer. So then I thought, well, we didn't even hear the footsteps recede or leaving the house. Are they literally just standing there? With the police on the phone, we make our trip up. With me in the front, we get to the living room and nothing. No person, no boot marks, no sign of entering from either of the doors, the back door, or any window. Everything remained locked. The police actually ended up coming anyway to make sure. They went around the house, checked the windows, but also saw that there were no signs that anyone could have gone in. We thanked them and they left. My girlfriend is convinced that these experiences have been her great-grandmother, somehow still wandering the house. Because of this, she has no fear at all, and communicates with her using pendants and witchcraft things, which I don't believe in at all, but I thought were worth mentioning. Whatever the case is, those footsteps were not the footsteps of some frail old woman. They were heavy and menacing. Is she in the wrong? Should she stop communicating with something just because she believes it to be her great-grandmother? Or should I just never step foot into that house again? I personally am feeling more of the latter option. These strange encounters happened back when I was 6 to 8 years old and lived in a small, mostly unheard of town in Maryland. I'm now 17 and live in England. Back then I lived in this town, as did my mum's older sister and my older cousins, and in both of our houses we had odd encounters. This is the first time I remember something strange happening. The year was 2011, and me and my older cousin Johnny were playing around in his room with the rest of our family down in the kitchen. His room kind of has a strange setup. It is connected to the laundry room and has a door that leads straight to the attic. I can remember me and him teasing my younger sister, who wanted to play his recorder but not letting her have it. At this point, my little sister gave up and walked away from us, and that's when me and him decided it would be funny to throw the recorder in the attic. We were both standing side by side in front of the steps, with the door open when he threw it as hard as he could up the steps. Me and him were laughing when we paused and saw the recorder had stopped when it reached the attic. It floated for a few seconds, then launched straight towards us at a faster speed than what we threw it up. I immediately jumped out of the doorway and he backed against the wall as it flew to the bottom step and snapped in half. We both looked at each other terrified and ran down to the kitchen to tell our family what happened. Everyone just laughed except for my mother, who is really into the paranormal and has had some experiences in the house herself. The next encounter I can't quite place, but I remember I was very sick, and it could have just been a fever dream, but the strange thing is, I only ever hallucinated when I was sick in that house, and have never had anything happen since, but I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. It's important to state that when I was little I had a huge fear of whispering. Don't ask me why, as I can't tell you. I was on my tablet watching Looney Tune episodes. That's when I started to hear a lot of it. I say a lot of whispering because it sounded like at least 8 people were whispering my name and other audible things. I got terrified and turned all the lights off for whatever reason and hid under my covers until I fell asleep. This last encounter took place at night during the summer of 2012. I was asleep and started to wake up. As I looked around, I realized it was pitch dark outside, aside from the street lights giving some brightness in my room. I looked down and realized I was sitting straight up, cross-legged, and my hands were moving, making weird symbols. When I looked ahead of me, I saw a little boy sitting on a few storage bins in my room doing the same hand symbols. As soon as I realized what was going on, I passed back out. Those are my stories, and I wish I had some explanations for them. It was the early 2000s. It's 3 a.m. and my house phone starts ringing. The phone was on the other side of the room. I stand up on the bed and start heading for the low dresser to answer it, and my wife gets up to get the phone as well. By this time it's at the 3rd ring, and I remember thinking, crap, it's going to go to voicemail. The ringing stops. My cell phone starts ringing, and I immediately change gears to someone really needs to get a hold of me. I grab my phone, and the caller ID is just 0000, lots of them. I answer, hello? And a voice comes through the line, as though it were a distant overseas call, parting through the static and asking, is this Joel? To which I replied, yes, who is this? Immediately, it was as though those words, is this Joel, were being pulled back through the line, echoing in reverse. There was static, and the call dropped. Jump forward several years. I'm installing a phone system, and we're joking around that it's so advanced, it could place calls back in time. I punch in my old phone number and call it, realizing the number is still active and that my wife may answer. I hang up and call my now years old and retired phone number. Someone answers. I freak out and ask, is this Joel? The voice on the other end of the line answers, through space and time, yes, who is this? At that instant, I immediately remember taking that call, and I am struck dumb. I cannot speak without thinking. I reflexively pressed the hang-up button. I'm now freaked out. I look over to my colleague who isn't as freaked out as I am. From his perspective, I called a number, and someone had the same number and answered. But he realized that was my voice on the other end of the line. I told him, I got that call. It was 5 years ago, but I got that call. Then we both freak out. I hit redial and get a message that the number is no longer in service. I call my home back and my wife answers. I tell her I'm testing a phone system and ask if she had any previous calls. Nope, none. I'm kind of freaking out, but with her on speakerphone I ask her, hey, do you remember that 3 a.m. call we got all those years back? Yeah? Where I asked, is this Joel, and the line went dead? Yeah? I'm just looking at my colleague with my wife still on speaker. Do you remember what year that was? It was before we had kids, so it would have had to have been around 2002 time frame. I don't know how to say this, but I'm pretty sure it was me that called. This is a story that I've never told anybody. Because, well, even I think I sound a bit crazy just by sharing it. Let me take you back in time. Me and my then girlfriend called Audrey went to see a movie a few years back, Transporter 3. We both smoked at the time and were collectively out of smokes, so on the way to the theatre, we go and grab a pack. Because of this, we were a bit late to the movie, and never had a chance for a pre-flick cigarette. Anyway, we saw the movie, and a guy on our way out called Mike, a friend of ours, came up and asked if we wanted to join him for a smoke. As we walked out the building, Audrey took off the plastic from the pack and tossed the plastic into the trash can. As we stood there talking to Mike, a guy came up to us and asked Audrey for a smoke. She told him we were on our last one. The guy didn't take kindly to that and started shouting about how she's lying and how she's got no right to lie to him. We offered him a "sorry dude" and walked away. Then things got messy. He grabbed Audrey's wrist and wouldn't let go and started shouting. Now I'm not gonna let someone harm the person I love, so I stepped between them and grabbed the arm he was using to hold her. Then, before I knew what was happening, I had horrible pain in my stomach and throat. My coat was getting wet, and Audrey was shouting, "Stop!" I also heard Mike saying, "What the hell?" Then I started feeling what I could only describe as exhaustion, and I no longer had the strength to hold my head up. As my head was dropping, I saw the red all over my coat, and the knife the guy was holding. My vision started going black, and the sounds became muffled. As I felt gravity overcome me, I heard a single sound coming from all around me, like it was the only thing that had existed. It was Audrey calling for my name for help, just once. The instant after I heard her, it felt as though the universe began to shake. A mid-range hum took over my ears, and all the black became a flash of blinding light. Then I was inside the movie theater next to Audrey and Mike, apologizing for startling us so badly. We were apparently white as ghosts. He then asked us if we would join him for a smoke, and Audrey quickly declined. We left the theater without saying another word to each other. I decided to break one of my own rules when I asked Audrey for a cigarette when we got to the car. She took them out of her jacket and put the plasticless pack on the dash in front of me. I began shaking when I opened it and saw a single smoke missing. Audrey let out the most fearful scream I've ever heard in my life when we drove past a guy walking through the parking lot. It was him. She insisted she stay the night at my house. When we arrived at my place, we turned on all the lights and just cried in each other's arms. I asked her about it next morning and she confirmed it wasn't all in my head, but that was to the extent we ever talked about it. And I'm sure this experience is what led to the end of our relationship. Things got too intense between us after that. I'm a people person, so it didn't take me long to work my way up the ladder at our hotel. I loved that hotel. It was really old, built in 1967, and despite the shambles it was in when I worked there, it used to be the most happening place in town. The decor was unlike a lot of hotels you see today. Elaborate chandeliers and imported Spanish tiles, and a beautiful handmade stained-glassed skylight. A lot of people were shocked our rooms were only $50 a night, but it wasn't long before I realized that something was just off about that place. We had this service hallway that connected our kitchen and storage rooms to all of our conference rooms. It was my first day, and I was taking the tour of the facility with my manager while he showed me around. I noticed how it smelt like a nursing home, like mothballs and death, and it was just unnaturally cold, especially for Louisiana in the spring. The deeper we go down the hallway, I began to feel sick, but I put it off as nerves. But whatever it is in that hallway/kitchen scared the hell out of me for a few weeks. I was working the 3 to 11 shift. At around 8 or 9 p.m., I went to find a guest some silverware in the kitchen. I was still pretty new there, so after searching for the light switch, I give up and use my phone to grab the silverware. That's when I noticed the sound of footsteps, really fast footsteps. I turn around to see something run right past me into the dark, knocking over the stack of chafing dishes on the prep table. Needless to say, I said screw the silverware and ran the hell out of there, and ended up calling the housekeeper who stayed in the hotel occasionally to grab it from the kitchen. But she said that when she went in, no one was there. No one who worked there wanted to go into that hallway. Even the cook, who would bring her granddaughter with her in the morning to keep her company while she got breakfast started. No one ever knew exactly what was back there. But again, I guess we just didn't want to find out. After that experience, I was sufficiently scared. but curious. I had become friends with one of our elderly breakfast cooks, a little woman in her 70s, we called Mrs. J. She mentioned that she'd been working there since the early 70s, and she began to tell me stories that made me never look at the hotel the same again. The owner was a cheap guy, even when I worked there. He didn't want to purchase actual security cameras for the entire property, so instead, he installed 2 actual cameras in the lobby, one at each entrance, and one by the pool, but placed a mock camera down the hall and by the rooms, giving the appearance of security, when actually they were just plastic boxes. One night, a young lady checked in, stinking drunk by herself at 1 a.m. She requested a smoking room, which were only located in the back side of the property on the 2nd floor. This area also has one of the many blind spots from our cameras. She goes to her room. No one hears from her for the rest of the night, until the housekeeper shows up in the morning to find the woman in the parking lot, covered in blood and whiskey and bloated. Apparently, after she checked in, she continued her binge on the balcony facing the parking lot. She must have fallen off and bled to death in the parking lot. The horrifying part is that she must have still been alive after the fall, because the trail of blood behind her almost looked like she was trying to crawl for help. And of course, because there were no cameras, the front desk was blissfully unaware. We always had problems in that wing of the hotel after. Domestic violence cases always came out of that wing. People's tempers just seemed to skyrocket when they stayed there. Another story she told me that I ended up experiencing. There was a country singer named Charlie Rich who died in one of our suites. Our suites were located inside the actual lobby facing the front desk. He had a pulmonary embolism while his wife was eating breakfast in our restaurant. Mrs. J was even there when his wife found him dead. Room 208. Ever since, a lot of customers complained of people knocking on their doors at odd hours, but the front desk never saw anyone go up to the room. One customer came running out in the middle of the night. He ran up to my night auditor and told him there was a man in his room. Of course, when someone went to investigate, there was no sign of an intruder. A lot of the times when the room would stay vacant for a while, the TV would turn on by itself. I even saw it once through the open window. It just turned on. And always to the same channel, CMT, Channel 71. Charlie never really bothered the staff. I'd even find myself talking to Charlie on our more quiet nights. Sometimes I even played my old country playlist for him. I ended up quitting after working there for 5 years. The owner was doing some sketchy things with my paycheck, so I said my final farewells to the hotel that I had grown to love so much. Not even a year after I left, the owner suddenly shut down the hotel. Not sure why, but all of the employees were told to not come back the next day, or ever. All of the papers, computers, furniture, and food, all left inside the massive, vacant, blood-red building. In the fall of 2016, I moved into half of a really old house that was built in the 1880s, a stone's throw away from the original campus of Indiana University, which is now a park filled with homeless people and drug addicts. The owners basically turned it into a weird duplex. My friend had lived in it right before I moved in and claimed that it was haunted. But I really didn't believe him, because he was a bit of an odd guy. The layout of the house was weird. You walked into the door and were in a living room type of space, and then you kept walking, and there was a doorway to a bedroom. Past that, the kitchen. No doors. The only door inside the apartment was to the bathroom and the one that led to the shared basement. So my first night there was uneventful. I was a little uncomfortable because I hadn't lived by myself in a long time, and was just feeling lonely and on edge. I stayed up late, and then eventually fell asleep, but I woke up again at around 3 in the morning. Cliché, I know. What woke me up was what sounded like a group of drummers drumming on every flat surface of the living room. It went on for a while, and I was completely terrified. It was just a cacophony of sounds. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally gathered up the balls to get up and check on it. As soon as I passed the threshold to the living room, it just stopped. Nothing happened the rest of the night, but I didn't get much sleep. A few days later, my friend was visiting, and he was about to leave. We were standing by the front door next to my bookshelf, and I told him how I was having trouble sleeping, and the story from the night before. As I was saying this, a book threw itself off the bookshelf and onto the floor 3 feet away. It had to fly past the dresser, the shelf it was perched, and landed between the two of us. He just gave me a creeped out look and said he had to go. I don't blame him. Eventually I asked the guy in the other half what was up, as he had lived there for 8 years. He told me that no one stayed there longer than a year, and they all reported the same stuff. For whatever reason, he said nothing ever happened on his side. Doesn't make sense, but there it is. On top of that, you would hear stuff shuffling around a lot in the room you were in. The light to the shared basement would randomly come on at night, even when the neighbor was traveling. Sometimes I would feel something get into my bed, like a cat, and nothing was ever there. Even after I ended up with a pair of cats, I had a lot, and I mean a lot, of nightmares while there. That was the bulk of it. But I have 2 stories that were more notable, and here they are. The first one was when I was woken up sometime in the middle of the night to a loud crashing sound. So in the living room there was an old electric organ with about 6 inches of clearance from the wall. I stashed a folding chair like you would buy in IKEA in between the organ and the wall. The crashing sound was the folding chair being unfolded and slammed into the middle of the room. By this point I already had the cats, and they were just sitting there staring at me when I came into the room. The second, I will admit, may have a conventional explanation, but I find it so much more scary if it were paranormal. I'll let you decide. At some point I reconnected with an old friend who'd moved home from California when his father got cancer. He ended up living with me, which was not ideal because, as I said earlier, there were no doors, no privacy. But we became close friends. Being poor, we made it work. So he ended up dating this girl who lived about 3 blocks down the road and would often leave and sleep over there. I got him a job where I worked 9 to 5, and we would alternate driving to work in the morning. Anyway, one night he's over at his girl's house, spending the night, and I went to bed. Sometime in the night he came back home, and he went to use the bathroom, which was in my room. Remember, no doors? So he had to walk past my bed to use the toilet. I wake up. He's there taking a leak, and I can see the light on under the door. When he's done and turns off the light, he lays down to sleep on the couch. It's winter, and the cats had been escaping and coming back late at night. And one of them had been outside earlier, so I wonder if he had come in with my roommate, and if not, if he would have seen him coming home and waiting at the door. So I decided to get up and check. I go to the door, open it, but there's no Luke. I close the door, and he is sitting right there by my feet with his sister. Okay, I look at the couch. The roomie's already fast asleep as usual. All is good, and I go back to sleep. In the morning I wake up and my roomie's gone. I go about my routine and step out to smoke a cigarette while my car warms up. As it gets closer to 9, I begin to debate leaving him to drive himself when I see him coming sprinting down the sidewalk. We get in the car and start for work. I ask him what time he left in the morning to go back to his girlfriend's house. He said he was there all night. I just about crapped my pants. I know for a fact the door was locked because the door had some ancient lock design that locked automatically every time you used it. And I also know for a fact that my cat was outside, and in the morning he was back inside. I really don't know what to make of it, but it was really unsettling. And just for fun, a small third story. I said earlier my house was not far from a park that junkies and the homeless frequented. In the summer of 2017 it was late, and I heard a bunch of noises on my porch, so I went to investigate. There were two dudes huddled right by my steps with a flashlight, and I asked them what they were doing. They replied using English words, but not something I would describe as a language, and they started walking towards that park, through my yard, and the whole time one of them was just calling back to me, "Hey, it's the dark. Sorry." About 10 years ago, my family and I were scheduled to go on vacation to Orlando, Florida. I was in my early to mid-20s at the time. I'm a big Disney nerd, and I wanted to go to the parks again since I hadn't been for several years. Everyone was excited and had everything planned out. It was going to be my mum and my dad, my brother, and me. And we were going to rent a house in Orlando that was a short drive from Disney. We'd done this before, and I didn't think anything about it. However, my mum and I both kept having this nagging doubt about the trip. At the time, both of us chalked it up to being nervous about the long drive or having to leave the dogs with someone. There was this nagging sense of, we shouldn't go. But it was Disney. We felt like we had to push these doubts and uncertainties aside for the sake of what was going to be a great vacation. So the trip happened, and a few months later we were in Orlando. Right off the bat, there was something off about the house. The owner contacted us and told us that there had been an issue and that we would have to delay our arrival by a day. Apparently the previous owners needed an extra day because of some unforeseen emergency. When we arrived at the house, the cleaning team was still working on it, and we ended up having to go wait a few hours in downtown Orlando until we could settle in. No big deal. It just meant shopping and planning for where we would eat dinner that night. We eventually moved into the house later that night and everything seemed okay. The sleeping situation was a bit odd, as it was actually designed to accommodate families with several young children, so this basically meant me sleeping in a child's bedroom on one small double bed with Finding Nemo wallpaper, which is fine. It's a good movie. So 2 nights into the vacation I had a terrible nightmare. I have nightmares when I'm stressed out, but not like this. It was the worst nightmare I'd ever had. I dreamt that I was running through an abandoned building, a big place like a warehouse, and something was chasing me. I never saw it, but in the dream I knew it was cruel and terrifying. It was like I was afraid to look at it. I ran and ran, and I heard its huge footsteps stomping the ground behind me as it got closer. Whatever it was caught me and I woke up screaming. Now this may sound comical, but imagine the terror of this happening at 4 in the morning. I woke up screaming, jumped out of bed, and ran as fast as I could down the hallway towards the hall. I didn't know where I was gonna go. I was just terrified and desperate to escape from the creature in my dream. Fortunately, my brother was next door and literally caught me before I ran into the wall. The first thought that went through my head, there was something here when we got here. My mum told me later that when I calmed down and caught my breath, I said in a very shaky, panicky voice that there was something here. How could we have known? I never went back to bed and sat up eating Oreos in the living room until everyone else got up and we were on our way to Orlando to do touristy stuff. We hadn't been out of the house for more than 2 hours when I suddenly became very, very sick. When I say sick, I mean symptoms of severe stomach virus. I was running a high fever, and by the time I got back to the house, it was like I'd been hit by a train, and I'd never been more sick in my life. I laid there in my bedroom surrounded by cartoon fish, and my fever burned. This was the worst that I've ever felt, and I began to hallucinate. My parents and brother made the decision to go back out and leave me in bed to recover, and while I was there alone in the house, fever raging, I saw something standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, dark, and robed. I didn't see its face. This is extremely fuzzy because at the time I wrote it off as a hallucination. It didn't speak, but somehow communicated to me that it would take my pain away if it took my hand. I vaguely remember saying no, and while I was feverish, I had another dream that angels were carrying me on my back, and I was told that I would suffer, but someday I would understand. The fever eventually passed, but I would spend the entire week very sick, and I did not see the black figure again or have any more nightmares, and at the time, I believe it had just been the effect of the fever. Long story short, the vacation continued even though it was a disaster, but it was the long-term effect that have kept my mind on this story for many years. This began a severe downturn in my life that continues to present day. My health and mental state declined, and I spent the next 3 or 4 years dealing with a variety of illnesses, and the next 10 years dealing with some of the most severe depression of my life. But it wasn't just me. My entire family has suffered since the trip. Depression, health issues, a financial struggle have been the norm for the decades since Orlando and the house. A lot of unusually bad luck. I cannot say for certain that this is a paranormal event, but the coincidences cannot be ignored either. I do believe, however, that there is something in that house, and I believe it chose to hurt me specifically, and that the darkness of its touch affected my life for many years to come. I can't speculate as to why it would have happened, or how it got to be there. I have always loved the outdoors. I was fortunate enough to be born in the Great Pacific Northwest, the Western Washington Cascades to be exact. My father and I spent much of my early years of life exploring the mountains, fishing and hunting. There are parts of the Cascades I know like the back of my hand. One of those places is called Goblin Creek, up the Index Galima Road off Highway 2. When I was a kid, we would drive up there to do some fishing and shooting, but also to collect a specific type of rock that, when cut in half, polished, would resemble a scenic picture of the view of the mountains from within a cave. I do not recall the true name of the stone, we just called them picture rocks. My father's friend and neighbor owned an art gallery/mineral shop that used to be a church. If you have ever driven through Startup on your way up from Sultan to Gold Bar on Highway 2, you might remember seeing the robot sculpture outside the shop that my dad built. This is the place that we sold the stone for $2 a pound. It was lucrative revenue for a preteen. The walk from the creek where we harvested these rocks to the dirt road wasn't particularly long, but lengthy enough that you could presumably get lost while en route if one didn't know where to go. In the years we spent at the creek, I had only ever seen 2 other people out there. One was a game warden that heard the gunshot from our target practicing session and tracked us down to make sure everything was fine. The other is the subject of my curiosity. When I was about 14, I distinctly remember hauling a backpack full of these rocks up from the creek to my dad's truck. Along the way, I ran into a man that looked to be about 30 years old. We both appeared to be surprised, as we would, running into anyone in this rather remote section of the mountains. But as I got closer to this man as he was standing down near the creek and I heading up the road, he seemed to grow increasingly more startled, as if he was seeing a ghost. He didn't say anything as I passed. He just stared at me, seemingly trying to figure out the appropriate words to ask me something. After I passed him, I remember thinking how much this guy looked like he could be in my family. The similarities were striking, and I continued on to the truck, dumped my load of rocks off at the truck and headed back down to the river with my dad. When I arrived, I told him about the encounter and asked him if he had seen this man, to which he replied that he had not. I have remembered this encounter quite vividly since then. Last year, I was visiting my family in Snohomish and decided to visit up Old Goblin Creek for nostalgic purposes. It had been about 15 years since I was last up there. Along the way up, I found out that the Index Galima Road had apparently washed out years before. Luckily, I knew of another way up, via Jack Pass. I found the dirt road and parked where my dad used to park, and proceeded to walk through the woods down to the creek. Along the way, I saw something that shook me to my core. As I was about halfway through the woods, I was startled to see someone else coming up from the creek. A boy, about 14 years old. He was wearing a backpack that looked to be burdened by heavy weights. And as we got closer, I began to get increasingly confused and shocked, as the boy looked exactly like I did at his age. I meant to say something to him as he passed, but could not figure out the right words to express what I was thinking at that moment. He passed me and kept going. I walked a little ways and finally stopped, when it all really hit me. I remember both the encounter from my teenage years and realized I had just lived the other half of that experience. Both the man and the boy were me, roughly 15 years removed. I turned around to catch up to the boy in the thick, western Washington woods. I ran all the way back up the road to where my truck was, to find nothing. There wasn't anyone else there besides the road for him to go down, and I hadn't stalled so long as to not be able to catch him up. He was simply gone. Curiosity got the best of me, so I hurried down to the creek half, expecting to find my dad fishing on the bank, 15 years younger, but found no one. I ended up going home, and decided that this experience was too unbelievable to even tell my friends and family. I just wanted to get this out to this wonderful community, to see what others thought, and hopefully know if anyone has had any kind of experience like this as well. 10 years ago, I was returning home from a road trip with 2 friends. I received a phone call from my parents asking when we would be arriving, and I explained that we were about 25 minutes away. About a minute later, we come around a bend. It was a full moon and we could see the reflection from the lake below us, and other than that, the road was completely empty. Suddenly, everything went completely dark in the car. No lights from the dash or gauges or headlights on the road, and the music also stopped and restarted the beginning of the CD we were listening to. There was now a vehicle pulled over by the police about a quarter of a mile in front of us that hadn't been there one split second before. I assumed I had dozed off for just a moment, as it was late, and I thought it was still quite peculiar though. After about a minute, the driver of the car turned the music all the way down and said, "Did that just happen to anyone else?" The other passengers in the back seat sat forward and abruptly exclaimed, "I thought I just fell asleep." We then realized the clock in the car was reading an hour later than it just had a minute before. To keep ourselves from freaking out, we decided that the car had possibly had a momentary electrical failure and reset the clock to an odd time, turned off the dash, lights, headlights and gauges, and restarted the CD player. But when we arrived home 25 minutes later, we were an hour late, and I am missing an hour of my life. And to this day, I have no idea how it happened. In 2011, my mother and father both had experiences in a hotel room with some sort of entity. My dad works in the film industry and had been staying there for about 2 weeks at this point. He works about 2 to 4 hours from home, so it's unproductive to drive every day. He had been feeling feelings of dread, hate, and misery throughout his whole stay. He's never been like that. I'm practically a photocopy of his personality, though I look just like my mum, and this is very, very abnormal behavior for him. He had been plagued with dark thoughts endlessly while he was there. His only relief was during the weekends, when he would come home to us. At some point, my mum went to visit him during the week, and stayed in the hotel room with him. She slept restlessly, and was uncomfortable throughout the night. He left for work at 7 a.m, and she woke up just to kiss him from bed and fell back asleep. Though she said it was strange because she didn't remember actually being asleep or awake. It was just strange idleness. At 7:30 she awoke to a feeling of supreme dread, the feeling of an evil presence. She felt someone pinning her arms to the side and pressing down on her chest, as if it were laying on top of her. She thought she was being raped, until she opened her eyes and saw that there was no one there. She could almost see something. Not physical. It was almost like something was there. People would say this is classic sleep paralysis, and I have my own thoughts about it. She called my dad in tears after that, and he told her about his experiences in the hotel. She left and occupied herself in the city. When Dad got off work, they went to the front desk to change rooms. I'm not sure if the attendant asked or if they volunteered the information, but they explained why. And they were told that they were the 5th set of guests to have moved rooms because of negative paranormal experiences. And after a little bit of back and forth, he revealed that someone had ended their life in that very room. As far as sleep paralysis goes, I believe that rather than a way to explain away and allow for dismissal of the encounter, it's actually a product of encounters. In any case, they were glad to be rid of that room, and as far as I'm aware, the rest of their stay was uneventful. As a child at the age of 4, my family moved into a newly constructed house in the middle of Tennessee, and this is where my first contact with entities happened. One of the first nights I was there, I will always remember walking into my parents' walk-in closet. As I walked in, I felt a cool and refreshing wind blow over me, and saw an entity that looked like a man made of TV static standing at the doorway to the attic. I felt completely at peace and happy. However, I ended up passing out in the closet and pissing all over my mum's shoes. Later on, as I grew to be about 14, I saw a burnt face and manacled hands floating around my room by the door. I remember thinking that the thing hated me and everything about me, and the intensity of its malevolence made me pass out. The next day, I would walk through the area where the entity appeared, and occasionally see it from the corner of my eye. I would routinely see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, of men in big hats and cats and dogs. One day I saw these shadows, and all of a sudden my sister screamed bloody murder. I ran into their room and saw movement out of my peripherals fleeing. My sister said that a big cat, not our cat, jumped on her and pinned her down. Both my sisters saw it. One day when I was babysitting my sisters, the brand new oven that we had suddenly locked and caught fire within, and it wasn't responding to button inputs or anything. The fire alarm went off and I called my dad to come home, and he turned off the gas under the oven. There was no explanation for the oven incident whatsoever. My friend, who was local, told me that the site of our house had 3 older houses before that had all burnt down in that one spot. Strange occurrences continued at the house, doors opening and shutting. My sister told me recently that after I'd left for the military, she saw a face out the window while she was reading on her phone. Lightning flash and the silhouette of a ladder falling. Then a mangled face pressed onto the screen of the window. The basement where I moved to as a 16-year-old was also a weird environment. I once dreamed that the walls were closing in and ran upstairs in my dreams to wake up on the couch upstairs. My best friend and I, under no influence of drugs, also simultaneously hallucinated that we were at a McDonald's. The basement seems to always amplify hysteria and cause people to act out of character. At a party for high school students we threw, a normally mild-mannered kid freaked out for no apparent reason, punched a pregnant classmate, and also I had a scary dream about my grandpa being a giant in my basement laughing at me. The next day, I found out he had died that night. I dreaded visiting my parents at this point because of the house. While they were very kind and loving when I was younger, by my teens they had become abusive narcissists and boundary-crossing maniacs, and quite frankly I was worried about them both. My father, a formerly devout Christian, had been visiting spirit mediums, which I found out through a reliable source. They also refused to admit our house is haunted. And that's simply the house. I also had a crazy Ouija board experience in high school. Me and a group of friends went to the oldest building at school and began playing. I was skeptical about the whole process, and although a few crazy things happened, the thing that really blew my mind is as the session was coming to a close, it spells out Brandon says hi from hell. As soon as it spelled that out, my friend whipped her hand off the planchette and started crying. Apparently, that was the name of her dead brother. Bear in mind, no one, not a soul, had even known about Brandon's existence before this session. We got to say goodbye, and that was the end of it. After that, strange events started happening to all of us. With everything that I'd seen in my house, and now everything that was about to come, I definitely feel like I was cursed somehow. I even went to a friend's dad's girlfriend's who used incense and tried to bless us, but she says that the evil she sensed was intense. Let me tell you, the next 3 years I was arrested 3 times, went to jail twice, was suspended from high school, kicked out of college, almost died in a car accident, and was forced to join the Navy to avoid criminal charges. And although the intensity in my life has died down a lot since then, I often feel followed and watched, and see dead cats out of the corner of my eyes too. I wonder, for real, if I am cursed. In college, my then boyfriend and I lived in an old house near campus. The house always kind of gave off a creepy vibe, but nothing ominous. And after living there about a year, I started seeing things from the corner of my eye. Things I couldn't explain but would convince myself weren't there. One day I was walking through the living room and could have sworn I saw a youngerish guy with long hair wearing jeans and a bandana sitting on my couch. When I looked again, he was gone. Shortly thereafter, the boyfriend's things started to get messed with. He left a stack of magazines on the bed while he went to the shower. When he came back, they were all spread out across the bed, not like the stack had just fallen over, but arranged in a grid. Another time in the shower, the water turned suddenly cold. He reached down to turn the hot water up, only to find that the hot water was completely off. He began to feel creeped out, but I never got a bad feeling despite the things I'd seen. I joked that we had a ghost, the bandana hippie guy I saw on the couch, and that he had a crush on me. One night, the boyfriend and I were cooking dinner together. He came up behind me at the stove and started kissing my neck. I joked, "Be careful. Jed," as in, that's what we started to refer to the ghost as, "isn't gonna like you doing that." He laughs and says out loud, "Sorry, Jed, you can't have her, she's mine." No sooner had the words left his mouth, there was a huge crash in the next room. We go to living room to inspect, and find the glass door to our entertainment center is completely shattered. Pieces of glass were flung all over the room like the glass had been hit with something hard. After that, no more weird things happened. No more creepy feelings, no more odd occurrences. Perhaps we broke poor Jed's heart. A few weeks ago, my friend's dad told me a pretty bizarre story that scarred me for life. About 15 years ago, my friend's parents, Michael and Julia, were woken up at 1 a.m. by a very loud thud that rattled the house. Worried that one of the kids had fallen out of the bunk bed, Michael went downstairs to check on them, but the kids were sound asleep and safe in their beds. Julia told Michael to check the house in case of intruders, and Michael checked the doors and windows before going to take a look outside. After about 10 minutes of investigating, he found nothing unusual and went back inside to go to bed. He found his wife absolutely worried sick, and demanded to know where the hell he'd been and what happened. Confused and tired, Michael told her he found nothing and tried to calm her down, before she pointed out it was now 4 a.m. and that he had been missing for 3 hours. She had even gone outside to check on him, and he was nowhere to be found and didn't respond to her calling his name. Unable to figure out what happened, they returned to bed and slept until Michael had to get up for work a few hours later. Michael owns a painting business, and a few hours after working on this house, he notices his eyes start to feel itchy. Then his eyes start to burn. Then after a few hours his eyes burned so badly he was holding his eyelids open to not blink because it felt like his lids were sandpaper against his eyes. His employees rushed him to hospital, and Michael was treated for second-degree flash burns on his eyes. He was told his burns were the equivalent of staring at welder torches without eye protection for an extended period of time. His eyes were treated, and he was lucky to have his vision fully restored. He is one of the most stand-up guys I know, and the way he told this story gave me the creeps. Dead serious and no explanation for what happened. His wife was there too, and she was visibly upset when he was telling me that story. When I was in college, I was coming home from work at about midnight. I lived in a super rural area. My car at the time had a large moonroof, all relevant. I pull up to a stop sign about a mile outside my town, only corn, fields and soybeans surrounding me. When out of nowhere this insanely bright light comes up, down on top of my car. Like so bright I can't see where it's coming from when I look up. We have had Samaritan helicopters that have flown over our house with those bright spotlights looking for a safe place to land when there was a car accident far from town. So I'm looking up and trying to see if I can see the helicopter above me. But this light is so bright I can't see a thing. I remember very slowly starting to make the turn for the stop sign towards town, when the light took off super fast ahead of me, expanded, and I can only describe it like something you would see in a space movie, and then disappeared. Next thing I knew I was crossing the bridge into town, which was about a mile away from where I last remembered being. I used to work at a hotel built in the 1800s. I'm a wedding florist, and we often go to the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, and after the weddings around 1 to 2 a.m., when everyone is asleep, and it's just a skeleton crew of different companies cleaning up the hotel, some pretty creepy stuff happens. I've seen a few women-shaped shadow figures in big dresses at the edge of the front balcony. Sometimes they're sitting on it. Faucets in all the women's bathrooms will begin to run at full power, whether you're looking at them or in the stall. A buddy I have who works there says a couple of kids fell down the elevator shaft while it was being repaired, and you can hear the pair laughing randomly, sometimes in the middle of the day when everyone is bustling about. He said you start to recognize their voices and can identify them, especially if there are no kids in the area. Supposedly the shadow figures on the balcony are a few different brides who threw themselves off the edge after being left at the altar. I have no clue about the faucets, but it only happens at night times when it's quiet. I've never really got spooked. I'm good as long as they let me get on with my job and wash my hands after using the bathroom. Sometimes I wish I could just talk to them and check to see how they're doing. My sister and I were just talking on the phone about some strange things that had happened to us all throughout our time in our childhood home. I mentioned that I thought our home was haunted because our mother had taken a rock from Auschwitz and brought it back home. My working theory is that the rock itself carries energy, or memory, or spirits that are imprinted into the stone because of the horrific trauma within the walls of the concentration camp. My sister and I were sharing stories and experiences that we had, which correlated with the time that the rock had been in our family home, as well as correlated to the movement of the rock from room to room. I am very aware that what my mum did was disrespectful and disturbed some energies. It's just taking a long time to put two and two together about the subject. Anyway, just for reference, we would experience in our house physical pain unrelated to any obvious injury, mental health struggles, and thoughts of ending our own life, unexplainable and unintelligible whispers, shouts, loud bangs, and the like with no discernible cause. Strange sounds coming from underneath the floor in my bedroom, odd lights and anomalies in my sister's bedroom, and just an atmosphere of constant unease and anxiety. Any ideas would be greatly appreciated. We don't know what to go about this, but we definitely want to talk to our mum about having something done to cleanse the house, and doing something with the rock that honors the spirits of the innocent dead, or banishing any lingering spirits connected to it. Please, all suggestions would be appreciated. We moved into the house in 2001 when I was 11, and my younger sister was 10. When we were kids, we used to wake up late at night and go to each other's rooms to chat, play with toys, and sometimes go downstairs to watch TV or eat directly from the fridge. Her room was in the front part of the house, so during the night the street lights would illuminate her room with an orange light. My room was on the back of the house, and my window faced the backyard, which had no lights. So during the night her room was always lit, and mine totally dark. From her room you could see the door to mine, and since we slept with the doors open, if you looked from her room into mine, you would only see darkness. This is important for later. One night, my sister was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, when suddenly she saw me standing in her doorway. She'd never heard my steps though. It was like 1 second she wasn't there, and then I suddenly was. She didn't give it much thought since she assumed I stepped in when she wasn't looking. "Hey," she said, "I can't sleep. You wanna watch some TV downstairs?" Allegedly, I said nothing. "Did you hear me? You wanna watch some TV?" She whispered a little louder, trying not to wake our parents. I stood there with a blank expression on my face without moving an inch. It was then my sister realized that despite all her room having this orange tone because of the streetlight, I was glowing blue and appeared to glow like the TV. After a few moments of fear, she said, "You're not my brother." Then the thing started to move towards her, but not walking, just sliding across the floor like a hologram. She put her pillow over her head and screamed so loud she awoke everyone in the house. When my parents got into her room, she was hysterical and explained to them what happened, but of course they thought it really was me just trying to scare her. I was scolded for it, despite me waking up when I heard the scream just like them. My sister knew I had nothing to do with it though. Sometimes my sister would see a tall, thin figure, glowing in pink, with a giant turban on his head like the ones Ottomans used to wear in the 16th century. Mind you, we live in South America, so not many Ottomans around here that I know of. This entity would come from downstairs at night, turn left and disappear into the darkness of my room. My sister said the thing that scared her the most about the turban guy was how fast he would climb the stairs. In fact, it was so fast that she could never have a good look at his face. There was also one time when my sister was around 13 and was babysitting my twin 8-year-old cousins in our house. My parents weren't supposed to be coming back until past 11 p.m. Around 8 p.m, they were all watching TV in my parents' room, when one of my cousins wanted to have a snack, so he headed downstairs alone. When he was halfway down the stairs, he heard some noises in the kitchen, like someone was moving around dishes and cooking pots. "Auntie?" he said, thinking my parents came back early. There was no reply. The noises stopped. Then the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer approached. He bolted up the stairs, got back to the room with my sister and my other cousin yelling that there was someone in the house. My sister locked the bedroom door, pushed the bed towards the wall and listened as the footsteps came up the stairs. As if this wasn't disturbing enough on its own, these footsteps didn't sound like this person was wearing boots or shoes. It sounded as if they were coming up barefoot. At this point, my sister and my cousin are all holding each other off, sitting on the floor, terrified, crying and freaking out. They really thought it was the end. They'd heard as this person came closer and closer until it was on the other side of the door, then silence and nothing happened. They never heard the person leaving either, just silence. At the time we only had one phone in the house and it was downstairs near the kitchen, so there was no way to call the police or anything, and they decided to stay in the room until my parents came back. When they arrived, they found all the kids crying in the room, and after hearing what happened, they searched the whole house for intruders. Of course, none were found. There were no open doors or windows, no forced locks or anything. After that, my cousins never stayed in the house alone,
until they were much older. This experience marked my sister, and she got so scared at the house at night that she started to stay awake all night in her room with the lights on and only slept during the day. She did this for about a year, from when she finished school until she found a job and moved out to her own apartment.
Where I live, there's a train that goes from my school to my home. The distance between those stations is about 15 minutes. One day, my friend and I left school together and boarded the train. We were both getting off at the same stop. Let's just say the station at the train is Station 1, and our home is Station 5. The distance between each station is about 3 minutes. We boarded at 3 p.m. and chat. I've taken this train more than 100 times before, meaning we know how long it takes, what our stop looks like, etc. Even the train announcer announces the stations as well. We constantly look outside for scenery to tell us it's our stop, and keep checking our watches and the stations we're at. We continue chatting, and then, as usual, we get off the train. We exit, turn right, and take the escalator down, and it's not there. Confused, we give a quick look around and notice we're not at Station 5, we're at Station 8. No problem, we just sat past it, right? So we checked our watch. 3:15. Both him and I have never been able to deduce what happened. The time needed to reach Station 8 would have been at least 10 more minutes. The train itself is automatic, so the distance and time never need to change. We take the opposite train and discuss what happened. We both saw the last station the train announced was Station 4, and was at the scenery we saw a million times over passing by a school we always used as our landmark. Up to this day I can't find a reasonable explanation of what happened, and it still creeps me out to this day. I have worked at this sandwich joint for over a year and a half. We run a tight-knit crew. I'm a good employee, in good standing with the owner and manager, and I am a little bit of a night crew manager myself. The restaurant itself is very slow, as we tend to receive maybe 20 to 30 customers within my entire 6 to 7 hour closing shift. This means that I naturally tend to start conversations with customers. I like to figure out where people work from their day jobs, where they went to college and how they live their lives and all that stuff. You can say I get personal, but hey, people like it when I'm not just some robotic employee. I even met a dude who went to Berkeley Law School, and he told me lots about life at school and all that. But that's neither here nor there. I like to talk to people. It gets me through the day, and generally people are pretty damn nice about it. I even have a mini little arsenal of conversation progress. Just heading home after a long day's work, huh? Nice, where'd you work? Oh, that sounds cool, did you need a degree for that? Oh nice, where'd you go to college? Did you like it there? Most conversations are extended versions of that, and it usually gets interesting, hearing about such diverse backgrounds. Now, about a week or so ago this man came in. I would say early 30s, dark hair, dark features, sweatpants, a Nike sweatshirt and a hood up. It was about 9:30ish and I was ready to close this bad boy up and go home. I had another half hour to kill, so I said screw it, let's start a conversation with the guy. Maybe his dad is like a congressman or something cool, or maybe I'll learn something from him. But holy hell, this guy was creepy. He wouldn't meet my direct eye line. He would talk to me by looking between or above my eyes. He kept his hand tucked in the back of his pants waistline. I realize that sentence is a bit hard to visualize, but the best visualization I can give is like when people tack a gun on the back of their pants. It was like he was clutching a gun. He kept his hands there the entire time. He was looking nervous and reluctant, as most people who commit robberies do. And as the sandwich making progressed, I was becoming more and more sure that I was about to be robbed. He asked for a ham sandwich on white bread. The way we lay ham is pretty formulaic, but due to his creepy demeanor, I was admittedly feeling nervous. The 8 slices of ham
ended up being folded over at different ratios, laid on top of each other sloppily, and did not look like too much of an appetizing sandwich. The man asked for Swiss cheese. The formula calls for 4 slices, so, as I always do, I picked up a stack of the triangularly cut cheese and fan it out in such a way where I can grab 4 and throw the rest back to the pile. I lay the cheese in a less than ordinary fashion, and the sandwich is still clearly missing its picture perfectness that you see on TV. These details may seem irrelevant, but I just want you to know the gist of it. You'll see why. The man asked if I could toast his sandwich. This means I'd have to turn my back to him for a few seconds to throw it in the toaster. I was running a lot of stuff through my mind, and I was not prepared to turn my back to him. This caused a sort of mini panic. I grabbed his sandwich and attempted to stand in such a way that I could keep my eye on him, with my waist twisted enough to get the sandwich in the toaster, but while still looking at him. As you may have guessed, I dropped it. I dropped the sandwich. I made a basic attempt to catch it as it fell, kind of like flared my knee up and tried to use my waist as a sort of cushion to hold up my elbow to catch the sandwich, but to no avail. I guess just imagine fumbling with your phone and then the weird motions your body makes in an attempt to catch it, right as you realized you've dropped it. I was panicking hardcore, and before I looked up, I was bracing myself for a very angry, creepy stare. But he is gone. He had left. He vanished. I didn't even hear the squeak of the door, the footsteps, nothing. I ran outside. I looked left, looked right, looked left again, and there were no cars driving anywhere. No cars were even remotely parked close enough for him to be hiding in or behind of. He was just gone. The sandwich was still on the ground, fallen face down. One of the triangles of cheese landed in just the perfect angular contrast with the tiles of the floor. Of the 8 pieces of ham on the sandwich, 6 were left betwixt the bread and the floor, while the other 2 flew off and landed adjacent onto the cabinet on top of which the toaster is located. Fast forward to last night. A man much older than the first comes in. I would say 60s, white-haired, dark features, probably about 6'6". Was probably the tall, dark and handsome type dude in the 70s or something. Pretty nice man, up until he started ordering his sandwich. I just got chills remembering that last part, because I have no idea how to proceed with the story. It's just so unsettling. He ended up asking for white bread, and I started to carry on my casual conversation. How's your night going? Just getting off work? The man answered with a stern affirmative and offered no other information. Okay, clearly this guy didn't want to talk about anything other than his sandwich. Weird. What kind of sandwich for you, sir? Ham. Alright, pretty stern guy, no nonsense. Maybe he's like in the mafia or some shady stuff, and he got nervous when I asked about work. Alright, fine. Let me make you your sandwich and you can get out of here. He then reaches behind his waist, in the exact same way the first guy did. I swear to God, the gesture and motion were all the exact same smoothness, timing and form. He kept his left hand there in the exact same way the other man did about a week ago. The same way. Everything started eerily coming back to me now. It was almost like the most jolting deja vu moment I had ever had, and I honestly thought it was just that, deja vu. But wait, there's more. The way I ended up laying the ham looked very similar. The distance between each slice, the way each layered peeled off the stack in ratio to the next, the way the slices fold over. I can honestly swear to you that I was building the same sandwich that I built a week ago. I was having one of those moments where a bunch of stuff just passes through your mind at once, and it actually is kind of surprising how many thoughts you can have in such a short amount of time. But I remember telling myself to just take the risk, and just reach for the Swiss, because I just had the feeling. How did you know I wanted Swiss? I was taken aback. He actually wanted Swiss. How in the world would I pass it off as a lucky guess? Well, exactly. How do you think? Lucky guess, I uttered, as I let out a meager, pathetic little chuckle. The man proceeded to say the most spine-chilling thing I'd ever heard. I read stories on Reddit about paranormal and weird stuff happening to a few people. There's actually a very popular Ask Reddit thread about it, and I always read the same variation of the quote, chills down my spine, and I have never really experienced that until that night. The man looks at me as if I told him the winning lottery numbers for the next win. Very inquisitive, very, very strong sense of passion in his words when he said this. No, seems like you've done this before. He just called out my déjà vu. He just confirmed to me that he was aware of my déjà vu. At this point, the phrase "the time traveler" just made its first entrance into my mind. I looked at him with the most ridiculously awestruck impression. I sat there staring at him for a good 5 seconds before I laid the cheese. It was a surreal moment. It was like the climax of this confrontation had already happened. But I still needed to lay the cheese and veggies, roll the sandwich up, and then ring him up at the register. How much creepier is this gonna get? I just didn't get it. I picked up the cheese in the exact same way I always do, fan out the top 4 slices and lay them back down. I was looking down at the same sandwich I had built a week prior, and I swear to you, the cheese, the bread, the ham, everything was just so uncannily similar. I credit myself to being a rational dude, so at this point I was just calling it déjà vu and trying not to feel disturbed. The man said, "Just lettuce and mayo, no toast." Phew. No toast. Thank the good Lord he didn't want it toasted. This déjà vu is over, and it's all just a coincidence, right? Well, some of you all may not know, but there's a thing called a hot food tax in some places. Therefore, when a sandwich is toasted, there's a button for hot food taxation, and it's something like 12 cents. So as a force of habit, I read the order back to the customer in this fashion. "Alright sir, so ham sandwich not toasted with a bag of chips and 2 cookies." He looked very concerned with why I mentioned it was not toasted. "Why did you have to specify it's not toasted?" he said. Then I explained to him what I said above, all about the hot food tax blah blah force of habit, because if a sandwich is toasted you repeat the order like, "Alright, a ham sandwich toasted with crisps and a drink blah blah blah." And after explaining that to him, he was just kind of inquisitive about it. Nothing too weird. I didn't want to keep him any longer, so I took his card, swiped it, and could not wait for him to get out. As he walked out the door, he looked back at me with the creepiest smile you can conceive in your little imaginations. He turned around and says what I honestly did not think I'll ever forget. "Just to let you know, I did not toast the sandwich because of the tax. I'm not that cheap." Okay, the guy's trying to lighten the mood, right? Sweet. Yeah, I know he's not cheap. I mean, it's 12 cents. But he felt the need to tell me the real reason he didn't get it toasted. "I just didn't want you to drop it." And just like that, he was gone. I still have chills everywhere. This was without a doubt the most spine-chilling thing I've ever experienced. I explained the whole thing to my father, and he came up with the idea that those 2 men were probably father and son, and were just messing with me. Am I making the rest of the details up in my head? Impossible. Do you know why? The man who owns the restaurant I work at owns one other one. Just one other, halfway across town. When Guy 1 came in, I was at a store about 8 miles away from the store that Guy 2 came in. The realistic chances of those 2 men knowing each other and tracking me down, finding me across town and messing with me like this is impossible. I and 3 other employees, the manager of both stores, the morning shift leader and my counterpart, the co-night shift manager, are the only 4 employees that jump between the 2 stores, and the chances of this being a planned and methodical prank is absolutely outrageous. I have no idea what I experienced, but if you actually took the time to hear all this, please tell me if this is a legit glitch in the Matrix. I was talking to my best friend one day about life and things were really calm and chill. My disclaimer here is that I was decently tired but have never hallucinated nor sleepwalked before or anything. It's still plausible that that was the cause, but it felt so different. To continue. Randomly in the middle of our conversation, she said that I entered some sort of trance and everything I said sounded like I was repeating it from a script. During this time, I remember opening my eyes and saw an oak desk under me with a paper with words and equations all over it. I remember writing with some sort of quill, but it was made of an animal bone, which was quite strange. So as this happens, I'm reading through the scribblings, and then it hit me, a huge wave of excitement and relief, as if I'd discovered something huge on this paper. And then I woke up and told my friend about it, and she suggested that it might be me in a past life or a memory or something. Maybe I was an inventor. I would throw all of that away and not worry about it, if not for what happened next. I smiled at her and began spewing out all kinds of knowledge. She was smart enough to write some of it down. And this is what I was saying to her. Our universe is a shadow of another, meaning that our 3D world is a shadow or projection of a 4D world. I made it clear that it was possible that our universe might be a shadow of a shadow. The speed of light, quantum entanglement, gravity, and other universal laws are all footprints that prove this, and will be shown to the world in the next few years. I made it clear that nature would not allow for a natural speed limit in the highest order universe. All human consciousness in every human is actually of a single being in a higher order universe. This means that we are all connected in a very direct way. We do have free will, and I kept repeating this one for some reason, and stating that if we did not have free will, the random cosmos would not exist. I don't know what that means. It was such a strange experience because I woke up crying and smiling at her. I explained that I saw my past life and could feel things that he felt, the excitement and whatnot. We talked for a while and she explained everything that I told her and everything she wrote down. So little of it made sense to me. I am completely confused as to where any of that came from, and I haven't slept in 2 days, but I'm extremely happy and excited about all of this. It feels so surreal.
I've been doing security at different places in different cities for years. Every hotel I've worked at had stories from staff about seeing ghosts or having strange things happen. The stories typically claim the ghosts are of someone who killed themselves, someone who was murdered, or a staff member that died. I typically don't believe any of the stories. I can usually tell when someone is full of it, or if they're just repeating a story they heard from someone as their own. I have purposely stayed in spots where people claim that ghosts are seen, and I've never seen or experienced anything that couldn't be explained with wind, bad lighting, or it just being a creepy spot to be in. There is one place that I worked at, however, where it genuinely was creepy, and I did experience something I absolutely cannot explain. Knowing I looked into any possible explanation and can still not come up with anything really creeps me out and has changed my mindset on ghosts or the supernatural. I always wanted to believe they were real. Now, I entirely do. It's just a matter of figuring out when people are making it up, or over-exaggerating, and when they're too blinded by fear to realize the real cause of what happened. So I used to work at a hotel in Palm Springs, California, that used to be Gene Autry's house and property. The property consisted of south and north buildings, where the guest rooms were located. There is a big spa, a ballroom, the Autry house, as well as a maintenance shed and security trailer. All buildings were tied together with landscaping and consisted of large, tall bushes and trees with dirt paths carved through them. Wandering around the paths, you would find grass areas, one with a fireplace, one with hammocks, an area for petanque, a tennis court, 2 pools, and a ping-pong table next to an outside bar. The south and north buildings had white hallways, with the guest rooms painted blood red. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I was going to see the girls from The Shining. The spa was called PSYC, Palm Springs Yacht Club, and not only had a creepy name, but the decor was dated. I hated going in there. It was super dark, had all kinds of corridors, showers and dark rooms that I had to check. The ballroom was a giant open area with a kitchen attached in the back, as well as a seating area in the front. The place wasn't very scary, and it was easy to lock down. In fact, I'd take my breaks in there to make sure I wasn't being bothered by anyone. I had to go into the Autry house every night, if it was vacant, and make sure it was clean and ensure the lights were off. The house was in a C shape, with the two wings being connected by the main room and kitchen. At the end of each wing there was a master bedroom. In between the master bedrooms there was a patio area, with sliding glass doors to each room. There were animal skin rugs on the ground, old paintings on the walls, and the faucets in the bathrooms were figures of lion heads. The north main room, top right part of the C shape, was a wall covered in wooden African masks, some shaped like animals, some evil looking with horns. I hated it. I stopped going into either main room because my imagination would run rampant. The rooms had an intercom system on the walls, and I was terrified I'd be in one of the rooms and have the intercom go off. I often imagined that I would look across the patio to the other room and find someone in one of those masks staring at me. There was a maintenance man called Mac that worked there. He was a really cool older guy that I talked to at the time. He was a Green Beret in Vietnam, and I had a lot of respect for him. He told me old combat stories, and we'd speak about life and family. He seemed like a perfectly normal guy, but he always had stories of ghosts on the property. He didn't willingly give the information up, but if you asked, he would tentatively tell you some. The more I got to know him, the crazier his stories sounded. He told me he would see the hammocks start to swing by themselves, and when he'd been nearby changing a landscape light, he told me the tennis court lights would go on and off. He had a story of a female who he would see every once in a while in the ballroom, dancing in a red dress by herself. Another story that stood out was about a person he had seen floating across the pool in PSYC. After the last few stories, I started to really question if Mac had a few screws loose from combat, or if he just liked messing with people. I would really press him on whether the stories were true or not. He was totally adamant they were true, and eventually stopped talking about it. I learnt to leave it alone. There were other stories of seeing a female in a green shirt in the bathroom mirror. Actually, one security guard quit one night. He said he came out of the bathroom and saw a woman in a green sweater staring at him next to the bed. Not saying anything, he ran out of the room and quit immediately. I know that part is true, because I had to cover his shift. One last story I remember sticking out was from a guy in room service. He told me he was delivering an order to Autry House one night. He took the path that passed the Pentecost court, and he dropped the food off and began to walk his way back. As he was passing the court, all of the chairs were lined up across the pathway, blocking him from walking past. The court has soft sand, so you can tell when someone has been walking through. He said he didn't see any footsteps. He put the chairs back and stopped walking that way. But this is now my experience. One of my duties for the night was to go into each vacant room to ensure all of the lights were off, note if the rooms were clean or dirty, and ensure the windows were locked, and make sure the air conditioner was set to 75. Sometimes you would walk into a room, and the phone on the nightstand would turn its speaker on, and it would start crackling. I always chalked this up to it just being an old phone and bad wiring, and I wouldn't get too scared if I told myself that while I did my job. Well, one night, I was checking the rooms in the north building on the second floor. I was going into room 46N. All of the lights were on in the room, which was typical. I started turning all of the lights off, starting from the left side, going around to the right, where I would enter the bathroom. The bathroom had two French-style doors that open outwards into the room. The left door was partially closed, and the bathroom light was on the other side. I opened the door outwards, all the way to the wall of the room. I reached it and turned the light off. I took a step towards the entry hallway of the room. I always kept the light on so that I could see my way out. I noticed the room was freezing. This did not seem strange to me. Sometimes housekeeping turned the air conditioning down to the 60s while they were working in there if it was hot. I reached up to the thermostat next to the bathroom. Before I could touch the thermostat, the bathroom door I had opened slammed shut so hard the walls shook. You need to understand these doors only had hinges and a simple locking device near the handle. No springs or arms attached. The doors were made of very light slated wood. If I threw the door open as hard as it could, it would not have slammed. I ran out of the room so fast. It took me only 3 or 4 giant steps, and I opened the door and ran through it into the hallway. As I was pulling the door closed, the deadbolt ejected out of the door and slammed into the door frame. I was terrified, but I wanted to close the damn door. I dreaded having to do it, so I reached in and quickly turned the switch and closed the door. I was so surprised by what happened I was tearing up. I decided I couldn't exactly chalk that event up to paranormal, unless I investigated a little bit. I went back into the room. The door was still closed. I opened it and threw it as hard as I could. The door caught so much wind it slowed down and barely got to the frame. I already knew the windows were closed and locked, so it wasn't the wind. The floor was not uneven near the door, so it wasn't being pulled in by gravity. I looked at the thermostat. It was set to 75. It was also no longer freezing cold. I got out of the room and never went back in. I never had any more experiences, though I avoid putting myself in a position of being in one. I would turn the lights off in the rooms as quickly as I could. I would look down when approaching the bathroom to ensure I didn't see anyone in a mirror. And I told my story to Mac and he wasn't surprised. He said that's just what they do when people don't believe they were there. He told me not to worry, as they were just making their presence known. Before I was born, my parents decided to move to the coast and open their own little seaside hotel. The first thing to do when they moved is to clean all the rooms, so they took half each to speed things up. My mum told me this story when I was little. She was in a certain room cleaning, doing some vacuuming, when the whole carpet started rippling. When I was little, I didn't think it sounded scary at all. I just thought maybe it had been caught on a carpet or something, so never really thought about it again. Fast forward about a month ago, I remembered this old story and made fun of my mum for thinking it was creepy, when it was obviously explainable. She looked confused and told me I must not have understood her when I was little. Apparently what had actually happened was that the entire carpet had rippled in a constant fluid wave motion, and that all the furniture and herself had been lifted up and down off the ground for about 10 seconds. She then screamed bloody murder at my dad down the hallway and told him they were selling the place before it had even opened. He managed to convince her otherwise, but she had never since gone back to that room. It scares me because my mum doesn't believe in the supernatural or anything like that, and doesn't have another creepy story at all, just this one that she doesn't like to talk about. I went camping with my buddy when we were 15 or so. We walked down from his family camper to sneak a cigarette in the field at the front of the campground. While standing there, we saw a light in the sky moving, erratically, in all directions really fast, very slow, and everything in between. Fascinating. We finished our smoke and headed back to the camper. As we walked up, his mother came racing out to us, absolutely irate, frightened. She said they had been looking for us for 3 hours. They had checked the field that we were in, and we weren't there. In our minds, we hadn't been gone more than 15 minutes. We lost 3 hours of our life and never found out how or why, and never got to the bottom of it. My girlfriend and I had been together for about a year at the time, never had big problems. We are both pretty relaxed people, never had a big fight and never had trust issues, the whole shenanigan. So one day I was out in front of my apartment building smoking a cigarette. This was before we lived together, and I had seen her the night before, had a nice dinner, gone out to a bar, then gone back to my place, after which she took a taxi home.
So as I'm standing out in front of my apartment building, she pulls up in a taxi. I wasn't expecting her and was pleasantly surprised to see her. I put out my cigarette, smiled and walked up to her, saying something like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" in a very friendly and happy way. She scowls at me and slaps me across the jaw. Obviously, I'm dumbfounded and at a loss for words, so I kind of just look at her. She never said a thing, just barged past me into the building. I followed her up to my apartment, asking her what was happening the whole way. She goes into my apartment, grabs her bag and some stuff she'd left there, throws a few things at me, breaking a glass or two, and knocking down a bunch of stuff on a shelf. She calls me a pig, says she knows everything and that I've broken her heart. I'm trying to figure out what's going on, obviously, and she stops on her way out when I touch her sleeve, glares at me again and slaps me, telling me something like, "I hope I never see you again," and walks out. I followed her to the street. She got in a cab and drove off. The street was pretty empty, and this was about maybe 8:30 to 9 p.m, and I watch her drive off. At this point, I'm at a loss for words, scared, and above all, sad. Then I'm watching the cab drive away, when at that precise moment someone hugs me around my waist from behind. I turn around and it's her, in running clothes. She was wearing heels and a leather jacket before, and I went completely pale. She just goes, "Hi," in her usual happy-go-lucky tone. Then she notices my look and said, "What's wrong?" I spun around. No taxi. It had literally driven away 5 seconds earlier. No way it could have turned in that time, and all the lights were red. I didn't say anything to her. I just ran upstairs. Her bag was gone, things were still broken, and my door was still wide open. So then I told her. We were both monumentally confused. There's no way I could have mixed her up with someone else, and she's an only child. We had security check the cameras, and sure enough, me following a girl to my apartment. The angles weren't great and the film wasn't great quality, but it's pretty easy to see me and my face, but hers was always hard to make out, but it looked a hell of a lot like her, but was never a clear shot. No way it was the same girl. Still creeps me out to this day, and we don't talk about it. We ended up doing a police report. They came up, gathered up all the broken stuff, and found only my fingerprints and my girlfriend's on them. Same with the door. And this girl got into my apartment building herself, which means she knew my door code. A little while after, I had a conversation with a professor at Columbia, who's a family friend, about this situation, hypothetically not wanting to sound the fool. He teaches something like philosophy and other things to do with superstition and explaining the unexplainable. One of his explanations was very close to this. Somehow, a mirror of our world running at nearly identical timeline folds over ours or collides with ours temporarily. Maybe she saw me at the bar the night before with another friend or girl, not seeing her face, and decided to break up with me the next morning coming to my apartment. The amount of disturbance that resulted in caused our two worlds to break apart right as she drove away. I'm not really one to believe in those things, but after this I don't consider anything impossible. Also, that makes me wonder, if it's true, how much did that mess up this mirror world? Things can't possibly be the same there now. She broke up with me. I don't know. It's a lot to think about.
A few years ago, I was driving down to Florida from Virginia. It certainly was time-consuming, but I was willing to take the time out of my week to see family. On my way there, I had to stop by a hotel to spend the night. I can't recall the name, but I know it was in Georgia. I had actually decided to spend a few nights there, since I had plenty of time to see my family, and I was sore from driving for hours. I checked in at the front desk and got room 465. Why I remembered this and not the hotel name, I will never know. But I rented the room for 3 to 4 days, just enough time to relax and enjoy the nice weather. Maybe even go for a swim. It's going to be perfect, I thought. But I was wrong. My first night was alright. The entire day was normal as always, although it was really hard to sleep. I tried to go to sleep around 10ish, but I didn't manage until about 3 a.m. The hotel must have been old. because throughout the night I kept hearing creaking noises. Not just that, but the people above me must have been energetic, because I kept hearing their loud footsteps throughout the night. I don't remember how I went even 5 minutes without opening my eyes, but I did, and I fell asleep. I was wondering if I should make a complaint about the noise, but figured it would be best not to, since it was my only and first night there. When I woke up, the room was a bit messier than I remembered it, but I was tired. Maybe I imagined it. I got out of bed and walked over to the bathroom to get my morning shower. I turned the water on to the perfect temperature, stripped out of my clothes and hopped in. I made sure the bathroom door was locked because I'm paranoid about these things. In case you've never been in a hotel, the doors are inaccessible to anyone that doesn't have the card, except, of course, service employees and such. I hadn't been in my shower long when I heard my hotel door open. This kind of freaked me out, but I assumed it was just the maid. "Hello?" I called out from the shower. I wait a moment only to realize nothing, but silence was greeting me. I open my shower curtain and look out into the bathroom, but I was completely alone, and it was empty, except for my clothes lying down. So I closed the shower curtain and decided to ignore the noise. As I start rubbing the shampoo into my head, I heard a small, faint click. The same click you hear when a door is being unlocked. The exact same click that I heard when I pushed in the lock for my bathroom door. My heart jumped, and before I knew it, I was shaking horribly. I heard the bathroom door slowly creak open, and before I knew what I was doing, I threw the shower curtain open. The bathroom door was wide open. I looked around the bathroom, but there wasn't the sign of anyone, not a single trace other than the door wide open. I immediately shut the shower off and ran out of the bathroom and into the bedroom, putting my clothes on as quickly as possible and running out into the hallway. I leaned up against the wall, sliding down it into a sitting position. I ended up walking down to the front desk and requesting another key for my room, due to the fact I never picked one up on my way out. After giving them some identification, they gave me a new key card, and I brought it back up to my room. I had to slide it about 4 times before it decided to unlock. When I opened it, the room was trashed. I couldn't make sense of it. It was like someone had recently been in my room and destroyed it while I had been gone. I don't know how anyone could have gotten in, and that concerned me. But I still had to stay one last night in the hotel, so that's what I did. After cleaning up the room, I checked every door in the hotel, making sure they were all locked. They were. I hopped into my bed, tucked myself in, and drifted off to sleep. I woke up looking at the clock. 4 a.m. I sat up in bed, about to place my feet on the ground when I heard something. The hotel door slowly creaked open. Chill shot down my spine faster than ever. I slowly shifted my head to look at the door as it opened, revealing the silhouette of a woman with dirty, long black hair, dressed in a short, torn-up, bloody gown. She began walking towards me. She walked as if in stop motion, bones snapping every time she moved forward. I wanted to scream for help, but I couldn't. Then I heard down the hall a couple walking together and laughing. Her head turned slowly. She heard it too. She made stop-motion steps towards the wall, making me gag from the sound. She climbed up onto the wall and crawled out of the hallway. I turned on the lights, packed everything I could, and ran out of the hotel as fast as possible. To this day, I've never seen her again. I think the hotel may have been shut down shortly after, but I don't know for a fact. I will remember how she walked, the most frightening thing I've seen in my life. On the way to Florida from the hotel, I realized something. I realized something that has been burned into my mind ever since. That day I was taking a shower and the door opened. When I looked all around my bathroom to find no traces from anyone, I never once looked at the ceiling. When I still lived with my parents, I experienced some weird things. My room was in the basement, and I remember a couple of times that I heard footsteps upstairs, but when I went to investigate, I found myself home alone.
I remember one night when I heard someone come down the stairs. A few moments later there was a door opening somewhere. I called out but received no answer, and I asked my parents about it the following morning, but they had all been fast asleep upstairs the entire night. I've also heard faint and short whispers at times, but I usually just dismissed it as random noise emitted by an old wooden house. The thing that freaked me out the most, however, was that one time I saw a shadow in the middle of a corridor, not up against a wall. I've caught glimpses of shadows and movement from the corner of my eye at times, but I usually dismiss it as some hair that got stuck in the corner of my eye, or me just being tired in general. This one time, however, I was walking down the hallway towards the bathroom where there was a shadow that flashed and then disappeared right in the middle of the hallway, just a couple of feet away from me. It was gone in less than a second, but it had not been in the corner of my eye. It had been in the center of the hallway and the center of my field of vision. It was over so fast, but it was definitely the shadow of a person wearing a long dress. I moved out of the house almost 2 years ago, and haven't had anything remotely similar occur to me since.
Back in 1987, I was sitting in class and had to this day the most intense and vivid daydream I'd ever experienced. I was sitting in class looking at the clock, when the next thing I know I'm walking through the mall with a woman who I've never met before. I was an adult, and I knew she was my girlfriend. As we were walking and talking, some guy started shooting people randomly. Before I had the chance to react, I felt something like a punch to my chest. When I looked down, I was standing over my own body, with a pool of blood spreading around it. I watched the chaos of the scene unfold in real time. My girlfriend was over my body screaming, and I was trying to comfort her. I watched the police neutralize the shooter. Then the other emergency workers cleared the scene. I watched them remove my body. I tried to follow, but I was unable to leave the mall. I lived/haunted the mall for a few years. As a spirit, I was bored, so I would mess with the security guards during the night shift. During the business hours, I would try to interact with the customers. Every now and then I would get someone to nod hello or walk around me so we wouldn't collide. I remember an elderly man sitting on one of the resting benches have a heart attack. As he was standing over his body, I walked over to comfort him. I had an overwhelming feeling that it wasn't his time to die, and told him so. He climbed and sank back into his body as the emergency workers were resuscitating him. One day I was sitting on one of the resting benches as a young boy around the age of 6 or 7 sat down next to me. He started talking to me, and when he did, I felt something weird happen, and I knew I was about to leave with him. I became his invisible friend. His name was Brian, and was the only child of a single mother. She was an abusive alcoholic. I helped him survive life. I taught him not to talk about me, so that they wouldn't think he was crazy. I experienced being with Brian for years. When he was about 10 years old, his mother came home drunk. She went into a drunken tirade and hit Brian. I lost my temper, and was able to slam her into the wall. She never hit him again after that. I watched him grow into a teenager, and when he was 18, I knew that my time with him had come to an end. We said our goodbyes, and just like that, the daydream was over. I looked at the clock and maybe a minute had passed. I had experienced just short of 2 decades of existence as a ghost in a minute of time. Growing up, my sister and I were good friends with our neighbor Matt, who had a dog, Molly. Molly ran away one day, so the 3 of us set out into the nature preserve behind our home to look for her. Matt's brother Chris set out separately. In the preserve is an old dam/mill from the 1700s that's rumored to be haunted. When we got to the mill, we saw Chris and the dog on the other side of the river, maybe 30 yards away. "Matt, I got her, I'm bringing her home," Chris yelled. But something didn't feel right, and the 3 of us gave each other that look. We headed home knowing Chris would be a bit behind us, since he'd have to go a mile or 2 out of his way to cross the bridge.
When we got home, there was Matt's mum and the dog. She was under the porch the whole time, she said. And a little while later Chris showed up, having never gone into that part of the woods at all.
I worked in a hotel from 2009 to 2012. The hotel is in Regina, Saskatchewan, but because it is still functioning, I can't disclose its name. I also wanted to let you know that I have seen spirits since I was very young, so I saw plenty before this, and have seen much more since. But here are a few of my favorite stories from while working there. One of the first spirits I saw was on the grand staircase. The hotel was bustling with activity, and I was heading upstairs to one of our banquet rooms. Coming down the stairs was the banquet manager called Marge. To an 18-year-old me, a very handsome blonde man in his 20s said hi, and I blushed and stammered a hi back. Marge had responded to my greeting, and the person looked to the right and looked to be revealing half of the face to be missing, torn to shreds, and then vanished. Marge must have seen the colour drain from my face, because she asked if I was okay, and then sent me on my way. I can still picture him as clear as day. Every haunted hotel seems to have that one room that gives everyone the total creeps. Ours was on the 11th floor, and it was unanimous among the staff that no one wanted to deliver room service there or clean it. One morning I was collecting trays from outside of the rooms on the 11th floor. Suddenly that whole hallway got really cold, and I could hear scratching coming from one of the doors. I tried to find the source of the sound, and of course it was that room. As I got closer to the door, the scratching got louder, until something banged on the door and everything fell silent. I obviously ran for it. I checked with the front desk, and of course no one was checked into that room. And for the grand finale, I had worked really late cleaning up from a wedding. I was by myself, and two of the kitchen guys, called Todd and Alex, offered to give us a lift home. We had been hearing weird noises all night, but had mostly brushed it off, and I would tell Alex was starting to get nervous. Todd had just finished locking up the last door in the hallway that contained the walk-in fridge, freezer, dry storage, etc., then flicked off the lights. We were all gathering our stuff to leave when we heard a door slam in the darkness. Alex bolted, and Todd and I both looked at each other confused. We turned the lights back on and headed down the hallway to make sure no one was back there and messing with us. We were halfway down when, I crap you not, every single locked door opened, paused, and slammed shut. Todd ran for it, but me in my dumbfound state pulled on the nearest door, and the damn thing was locked. I hightailed it out of there, jumped in Todd's truck, and we never spoke of it again. I lived in a haunted house. Let me elaborate. The house was in Milford, Connecticut. We moved from Connecticut the August before I was in first grade, and to there from Oregon when I was about 2 or 3. All my first memories are in that house. I have an older sister and brother, my brother being 10 years older and my sister 5 years older. My brother was in high school at the time, and my sister elementary. The layout of the house wasn't too odd. You open the front door to a large living room, and to the right, there are stairs to the second level. Also a closet along the wall on the left. You walk through the living room, and on the left is a large fireplace with one full-length mirror, and on the right side facing the fireplace. Next to the fireplace was the hallway that went to my room at the end of the hall. A bathroom on the right side, a basement door on the left, and my parents' door last. Going in the basement, it has the floor space of the main floor, so it was rather large comparatively. Walking down the stairs to the left was the laundry equipment, plenty of room for storage but was never used. On the right side was a TV, coffee table, couch, the usual stuff. Because I was little, I doubted every memory I ever had of that place. I never once trusted myself. But now that I've seen some relatively strange paranormal stuff elsewhere, I've had my numbers read,
tarot cards done, palms read, all that touristy fun stuff. They say I'm supposed to have some kind of connection to the other side. I'll let you make your evaluation on that, jokes aside. Anyhow, I was talking to my brother about a month ago. I was looking up the house on Google Maps and wanted the address. He calls me immediately. I know something's going to go down because I've talked to him on the phone maybe 3 times in 25 years. We're close, but would rather not talk on the phone. The first thing he asks me is what I remember about the house. My brother is a cop, so between that and our upbringing, every question is looking for an answer. Every question is loaded with all this extra stuff and implications. It's never just a simple question. So I tell him all the crazy stuff I remember, and it turns out he remembers some of it too. What kind of little kid makes the effort to put sand on the inside of windowsills? The kind that's curious if the people inside the house at night are breaking in. What kind of kid lays ropes, strings, and all kinds of stuff all over the house that would look like laser grid patterns to monsters? The kind that has seen them and is afraid. What 8 to 11-year-old girl won't go to sleep in her room at night and will sleep on the floor of their brother's room? The kind of girl that's forced to sleep there because they're scared out of their wits. Let's get to the stories. There was an occasion where I was taken out of my top bunk and placed gently on the floor with both beds made when I awoke. I remember a bright light from outside my room light up my room, and somehow one of the lights seemed to move me. My dolls would also eventually start moving. A family friend who died of breast cancer about 9 months after I was born had made the effort to find a Cabbage Patch doll that looked exactly like I did. I didn't have any friends. My parents were mostly checked out, so I was alone. I loved that doll with all my heart. It made me feel stupidly crap that I couldn't give my doll life. I thought I wasn't loving him enough, but I knew I was loving him with all I had. Later in life I realized all those moments hurt deeply my self-esteem, and as a result I've never felt like my love was enough. Eventually I obviously figured out dolls aren't supposed to move, but still I always wish that mine would. Sometimes I'd look at the mirror and I'd see an old lady or man instead of my reflection. I'd walk up to go to the bathroom, and my mum would be having a full-on conversation with someone, but there was no one there. An old lady ghost in the basement was yelling at me to go upstairs because she was busy doing the wash, watching people freak out when my brother had a sleepover. Then you'd never see the kids again. It was a night in particular when I was sitting on the stairs of the basement feeling like a big grown-up kid and watching a movie with my brother and his 3 friends. After the movie I went upstairs to go to bed. Before I get some water and go to the bathroom. When I was done, I heard my brother yelling for me. So I go down and everyone swears I came down the stairs. So it's lights out and my brother is talking to me, freaking them out. Then one kid fell asleep, and his feet happened to be in what little moonlight was shining through the little windows, and he starts moving around. So my brother and I start whispering and then stop talking and watch him. He's tossing and turning as if he's pretending to be asleep, his feet still visible in the light. He sits upright and tells my brother to stop touching his feet, and then yells at us. Whichever one of us was touching his feet had the coldest hands he's ever felt. Whilst he's saying this, his foot gets a little tickle. He stops talking and goes white, and tells us that something is touching his foot. But he can see his feet, and there's nothing there. He gets up to see if it's another kid playing a prank, but it isn't. So he calls his parents. And after the kid left, my brother and I are downstairs. One of the other kids says, "Hey, I couldn't sleep and was watching the other guy toss and turn, and there wasn't anyone around." I know he thinks we're messing with him, but there really wasn't anyone. You guys are over there, and me and the other guy were here trying to sleep. What's up with your house, dude? None of the kids would ever return to the house again. I once asked my sister about it, and she didn't say anything, just walked away. My parents pulled me aside and told me in no uncertain terms that I should never ask her that again. I'm 40, and they haven't pulled me aside since I was in high school. I don't know what it's about, but it must be some serious PTSD levels of seriousness. My sister slept in my brother's room every night she was able. When she wasn't allowed, she'd sneak out. My brother would set her bedclothes aside and assumed she'd sleep in there. There was a little door to the attic behind my brother's dresser. We didn't use the space either. If you went inside, there was a path that went to a door to my sister's room that opened in her closet. General messes. Things turned on, or worse, would get turned on or off in the middle of dinner, and no one would notice until it was time to eat and nothing was cooked. The first time that happened, I got in trouble for lying. It actually got to a point where I was surprised that other people didn't have ghosts in their home. Being scared was normal. Everyone went through it through childhood. I just happened to be scared all the time. We'd always see apparitions move in and out of the house. Well, I used to set up snares and trap ghosts and monsters, and consume every detective novel and magazine and book, and anything spy to help me learn what was going on. Thinking everything was normal and average, but feeling like it was all wrong. I used to watch a painting move, and was randomly scared of places in my house, even though I couldn't explain. There were cold spots, things being moved, all the regular haunted house stuff. My sister even messed around with a Ouija board, and made stuff worse for a while. Eventually I would just tell the ghost either to be my friend and stick around for a while, or go back to wherever it came from. And that was the last of it. I guess it really didn't want to be my friend. My wife has a background in early childhood education. After we got married, she noticed that I may have ADHD, and potentially some autistic stuff going on. After a psychologist, I went for testing, a lot of it. We met with her, told her what was going on and what kind of testing we wanted, and I requested a schizophrenia test. How else am I seeing and hearing stuff no one else does? Turns out I have a few learning disabilities, which in hindsight is pretty obvious. I'd overachieve in everything but my learning disability areas. For me, it's math and language. As a result, I developed a stutter as a kid, because I didn't know how to communicate things. Stuttering was my way to collect my thoughts about what I wanted to say. Aside from that, I told the doc about everything, and she didn't have any answers for it. At least, in the Connecticut house, I wasn't the only one. We just never talk about it. Ever.
When I was in high school, I had a habit of taking power naps while everyone was having lunch. I'd curl up in a quiet part of the hallway, put my jacket over my face, and sleep for maybe 15 minutes. This one time I was startled out of sleep by a passing crowd of fellow students. Everyone was in a rush to make it in before our strict teacher would start taking notes of absences. I ran after the crowd, walked up the stairs straight into the right classroom, and sat at the only desk that was left for me. The teacher told us to open our books. Then the world froze, and suddenly the situation sort of reset. I was back in the hallway, blinking sleep out of my eyes because I'd been awoken by passing students. I thought it was a funny coincidence, some sort of brain fart. I went upstairs after the others and sat at the same empty desk. The teacher told us to open our books, and again, reset. The same 2 or so minutes. Woke up to a noise, go upstairs after the others, sit at the same desk. Teacher tells the class to open the books, replayed again. For the first few loops, while it was still more interesting than terrifying, I had so many questions. Was I having an intense nightmare, going insane or something? I was and am an atheist, with zero belief in anything paranormal, so no options other than, this isn't real, didn't cross my mind. Some loops later, I started doing all these things I'd read about online to see if it was a dream. You know, reading signs, trying to put my hand through a wall while looking away, that kind of stuff. Everything seemed as real as reality to me. My theory and contemplation got more outlandish though. If there was some sort of complex temporal situation going on, the loop would continue indefinitely. Would that mean I'd eventually die of hunger? At the same time, I tried to mess around with the loop itself to see if something would happen, deviating from the route, but nothing happened. I tried staying in the hallway or going outside, but after about 2 or so minutes I was always back in the hallway regardless of my actions. I tried to engage other students and teachers, but everyone seemed preoccupied with their own tasks. If I managed to get someone to talk to me, they were always irritated with whatever I did to deviate them from the loop. "You shouldn't skip class, or the teachers are going to be mad if we're late." I get the same default responses and same tones over and over. I even tried to injure myself with scissors, an incredibly ill-advised move, I know, but at this stage I was basically out of my mind with fear. Luckily, it only resulted with the loop ending faster. I honestly didn't know how many repeats of the loop I experienced, because as soon as I stopped counting as I was getting more and more scared, I stopped wondering about the inexplicable hows and whys. As far as I could tell, the situation could not be explained, at least not by me, and I was the only variable in the loop. So I became obsessed with the idea that perhaps a certain behavior was required or expected of me. I'd seen the time loop trope in fiction before, but in those scenarios there was usually some sort of event that had to either be prevented or instigated. In my case, there was nothing. My self-imposed goal became to stop acting like I was aware of the loop, so I tried to replicate my behavior from the first loop down to the finest detail to my best recollection, but that changed nothing. But I latched onto the idea of perfecting this routine because I had nothing else. Loop after loop of the same thing, they all blurred together in my memory. When you're scared of a fate potentially worse than death, it's incredibly easy to stop asking questions and just function on autopilot. The thing is, I'd have written the whole thing off as a dream, if not for the very last loop. By then I'd completely accepted my fate of living in some sort of limbo where the loop no longer reset. My teacher told the class to open our books, and when I usually would have woken up in the hallway again, the world hung, I guess. I don't know how else to describe it. Time seemed to pause for less than a second, just like you might experience in a game when you quick save, and then the teacher went on with the lesson of the day, and life resumed. I don't know what to do with this experience, other than share it on the internet, in the hope that someone is amused for a few minutes, or perhaps if they've got answers to what the hell happened that day. December 2018. I was alone at home at one of my exes, and she was out of town at work. One night I woke up to the sound of rumbling and keys opening the door. I get up and run towards the hallway that overlooks the stairs and front door. When I see the handrail, I immediately notice the handrail of the stairs is decorated with lights and a poinsettia wreath spiraling down the rail. I was incredibly confused as I had never decorated it. Then a second later, a man walks in the door. I still remember his face so well. He was tall, maybe 6 foot, military haircut. I think it's worth noting that we live in a military base. Basically everyone who lived in housing was active military. He was light-skinned, he looked mixed, thin, but in shape, and he looked like a runner. While I'm watching this man walk into my house, take his jacket off and put it to one side, on top of this small bench. All of this is happening so fast it felt eternal. As I'm watching him do this, I say out loud, "What the hell?" And he looks up to where I'm standing, and he's just as surprised to see me, and then he goes, "Oh crap." Then I run back to my room and hop back in bed. It's only then that I wake up again and immediately run towards the hall, but this time there's no poinsettia wreaths and lights on the handrails, and there's no man coming in the door. It's as if I had crossed into an alternate reality for a minute. Perhaps in a parallel reality, that man lived in the house and I somehow glitched and came across into his universe and saw him. He's probably still talking about that incident to his buddies, like I talk about it to mine. It was really bizarre. This happened around 4 years ago when I was living in Oregon. I had just accepted a job at a hotel as a sous chef. The hotel had just recently been built, and for whatever reason the walk-in freezer was the last part of the kitchen to be completed. Several different contractors would start the work on it, only to quickly stop, not wanting to spend a lot of time in there. They didn't even want to be around the restaurant area in general. Nobody was really sure, not really sure why the people that hired the contractors didn't really implore further, and the contractors didn't really explain why. Anybody who wasn't a guest or employee seemed to act skittish or anxious while there. Fast forward a month or two, and the freezer was finally all built and operable. Good timing, because we were to cater the services for a couple of the contractors who had finished up work on our freezer. The man and woman died shortly after finishing. I think it was under strange circumstances, like carbon monoxide poisoning in the garage or something. Anyway, back to the weird thing with our freezer. It was around March when this happened. A young girl was just hired to help in the kitchen. She was working towards being a pastry chef for the restaurant. But first, she had to just get her foot in the door. I liked her. She was really serious in the kitchen, but she was really cool elsewhere. It was good to be able to switch like that. One night we had somewhat of a rush before closing. If I remember correctly, we closed at around 9 or 10, and I had to relocate to the bakery/dessert section for the remainder of the night, since dinner wasn't being served anymore. And I had invited her to join me, so she could learn a little, and I could assess her skills. We were the only employees still there that night. Slow night, so I let a couple of people go home. We had to make about 20 mousse desserts, and then we were done for the night. I showed her how to make them, watched her make a few, and then we went to the dining room to talk to a few customers. I returned maybe 15 minutes later and all the desserts were made, and they looked rather good. She was nowhere to be seen, so I took the desserts out to the customers and promptly returned to shut down the kitchen for the night. About 10 minutes later, I was basically done in the kitchen, and I just had to check the temperature of the refrigerator and freezer. I hadn't seen my employee in this time, but didn't think much of it. I found her on the freezer. She was on the floor under the bottom rack in the fetal position. Something made me not even call her name or really investigate. I just quickly tried to pull her out from under there. Her body was already ice cold and blue. She'd been in there for hours, or days, even though the last I saw her was half an hour prior. She had undoubtedly already passed. I called 911, told them everything, and had to go to the main office to check security tapes. They also spoke to some of the customers, as I was obviously suspect, since we were the only 2 employees there. Upon investigating the tapes, they decided she had just quickly entered the freezer and laid down on the floor on her own. The officers seemed to want to get the case taken care of as quickly as possible and leave. EMTs noted that it seemed she'd been in there for at least 2 days. Her internal body temperature was very low, and her eyes had basically frosted over or something. I don't remember how they determined her time of death, but it was really rushed, and they quickly determined it as suicide. I don't think there was an autopsy for some reason. Not many people were notified of the death, and after the restaurant had been closed for a few days, it opened again as if nothing had happened. I still think of her sometimes, and wonder what exactly did occur. I'd like to say that's the only strange experiences that I've had at the hotel, but there is more. A couple traveling with their son made the reservation to stay at the hotel one night. The dad said that they'd stopped in that town because it was halfway through their trip, and they were very drawn to the hotel. They arrive and shortly after head to the restaurant. The dining room was pretty full that night, as it was the weekend and the restaurant was open to the public. Family is serviced, stays for about an hour and begins to leave. The kid then isn't there anymore. Both parents claim it was really confusing and freakish because in the span of just a few minutes, having their plates cleaned and the bill paid, he silently slipped out and neither parent noticed. I felt sorry for the parents. They seemed genuinely confused, but kids wander off all the time, no big deal. The waitstaff and other staff were approached by the not yet frantic parents but no one had been able to recall see a young boy walking around on his own. The dad was escorted to security to see if they could help find the kid. The mum stayed in the restaurant in case he returned and remained nearby so that he could find his way back. I remember this part particularly well because the guy working security cameras seemed really weirded out, and we would talk about it pretty often. He had a stroke about a year later, which was a shame because he was one of the smartest guys there and he knew a lot about the weird stuff that happened. So he was reviewing the security tapes with the dad. The view of the family in the dining room wasn't the best, but you could see them. In the time the couple said their son disappeared, they were seen talking to him as he slowly inched off the booth. It looked both natural and weird, like when a kid doesn't want to go somewhere alone or something. The dad insisted neither him or his wife remembered it happening like that. They had both been talking to him at the time. Had he slipped their minds, perhaps? In their initial story, they said they'd both been talking to him, and they were focused on paying and wrapping up and whatnot. In the tapes, they were talking to him and watching him leave. According to the tapes, about 2 minutes after him leaving, they started to look around. It's as if the past few minutes hadn't happened, or they'd just forgotten and noticed something was off. Weird differences in their memory versus the record. Most people get to the hotel by crossing a bridge. It's a really beautiful but slight bridge. I love crossing it. It's about a 10-minute walk from the hotel. Anyway, about an hour and a half goes by after the kid goes missing, and an older couple were crossing the bridge. On the furthest side from the hotel, they saw what they thought was an animal stuck between posts under the railings. They discovered it was the boy. He was deceased. He wasn't seen by any person or camera between walking away from his parents and being found. 911 was called. He was clinging to the post under the railing, like he was trying to crawl to the other side, only using his arms to pull himself along. When CPR was started, a significant amount of water was released from his lungs, and his official cause of death was drowning, even though the body was dry and he was found on the bridge, not in the water below. No theories have been presented as to how he could have drowned in the water below, pulled himself up across the bridge, and dried off in that time. Both parents go to their room early in the morning to collect their things and get a little bit of rest. They were offered almost a full week's free stay so that they could get everything figured out. Security guy goes to check in on them and find their room devoid of any sign of their stay. They were gone without a trace, not seen by anyone. The employees are now the only people that seem to remember the incident, since the police basically let it slide and forget. Nobody at the local station will admit to it happening. It's almost as if it never happened. It's definitely one of the more chilling things that happened to me while I was there. I hope you all have happier hotel stays wherever you go. I was home alone, where I am currently living with my mother, a small dog, and my 2 small dogs. I was in the dining area at the front of the house, talking on my cell with my stepmother and cleaning the dining room table off, which, since COVID has us both working from home, has become a home office desk. In the dining room and directly in front of this desk/table, there are 2 large windows that run up the height of the wall from the ceiling to the floor. The windows look out of the front porch, followed by the garden, the front lawn, the sidewalk, and the street. If I look out into the left or south, I have a clear view of the driveway where I was always parked on the left, and my mother to the right. It was about noon on this day, and my mother had gone to the grocery store to pick up a few things, then for a quick stop off at a friend's house. I didn't know when she would be back, but as I was standing there chatting away, organizing my home dining office area, I stopped for a moment to gaze out the window. I was half paying attention to the conversation with my stepmother and halfway thinking about how I would like to decorate the front of the house for Christmas this year, when I saw my mother pulling up on the street heading to the driveway. I watched until she was slowing and turning in, and thinking nothing of it, I walked over to the coffee pot to top up my mug. As I was pouring the coffee, I remembered that she had mentioned stopping for groceries, and if she had done so,
she would have wanted me to help her carry them in. So I took another look out the window to see if she appeared to have the groceries, and sure enough, she was now parked in the driveway and out her car, standing behind her with the trunk open. And I assumed at the time it was to collect the bags and carry them in. I told my stepmom I would talk to her later, and we hung up. I set my coffee down with my phone on the kitchen table and headed out the front door, which I should mention is less than 10 paces away from where I was standing. I opened the front door, walked out onto the porch, and stopped dead in my tracks. There was no mother, no mother's car, no nothing. Her side of the driveway was completely empty, except a neighborhood cat. Strange, I thought. I quickly assumed that she had forgotten something at the grocery store and decided to go back to the small corner store in our neighborhood to get whatever it was. However, no sooner had I considered that possibility did I then consider that it would have been quite difficult, if not impossible, for her to have put the bags back down in the trunk, close it without me hearing it, get back in the car, and back out onto the street and drive away in the small amount of time it took me for me to set my phone and mug down and walk out the front door. She would have had to have made a mad dash out of there, and backing out of our driveway, unless you're looking for a collision with another vehicle, has to be done slowly, as our driveway is on a rather steep incline, as we live in the southern part of the USA, in Louisiana, known for the heavy rains and flash flooding all year round, hence the incline. If you back out too quickly, you might get lucky and get away just as quickly, but your rear fender will not be coming with you. Secondly, my house is the last house on this side of the street that actually faces the street, which runs from north to south. The house next to us, the actual corner house, faces the street that crosses ours, running west to east, and because of that, the fence that runs the length of the backwood also runs the length of our driveway, and continues almost all the way down to where the curb brings the street and driveway together. The design all but blocks the view we have of any oncoming traffic from the south. If you back out too quickly, you can easily back out in front of an oncoming vehicle that was just out of view moments earlier. Lastly, if there were an annual award handed out for slowly backing out of driveways or pulling out of parking lots, my mother would have her walls covered in plaques and trophies. I've never seen her rush out and go speeding down the street, not ever in my entire life. Considering all this, I decided I would call her to see where she had gone to and settle the matter, all the while staring and having a little chuckle with myself as I remembered those glitch in the Matrix stories I had grown so fond of. I called and she answered, and when I asked why she'd left, she answered me with a bit of confusion, telling me she had gone to a friend's house and then to the grocery store, and reminded me that she had told me as such before leaving the house earlier that day. When I told her that I had seen her come home, and that I was asking about where she'd gone to then, not this morning, she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. She said she was about 10 miles from the house still heading home, and actually hadn't come home yet at all. When I told her about what I'd seen up the driveway, she told me I was freaking her out, and that she'd be home soon. We hung up and I stood at the same window waiting, and like clockwork, within a few minutes of ending our call, I watched her drive up the street from the same direction she had done so before, north heading south. I saw her car slow and come to an almost stop to allow her to turn in the driveway, and as I walked from the window to the front door and out the house to help with the bags, she pulled into the driveway and parked. By the time I'd made it to her parking space, she was getting out the car, and this time I stood with her behind the car with the trunk open and started to collect the bags to carry in. I watched the entire scene played out, just as it had done when I watched it from the window minutes before, with the only difference being I was standing outside with her watching it instead of watching from the dining office window. Everything looked exactly as it had when I watched the scene play out earlier, down to the clothes she was wearing and her mask hanging from her left ear, which is interesting to note, as she rarely hung her mask off her ear, but I do remember noticing it hanging there the first time. Anyhow, we carried the bags in and life went on as usual, as it tends to, and I considered two possibilities, one being a quick but uneventful jump into and then return from the future, Had that been the case, the events would have unfolded exactly as they had before, and I would not have been standing with her behind the truck the second time. I would have watched her from the window just as I had the first time, and the second is a glitch in the matrix of our world. If I wasn't so familiar with these stories, I may as well have considered the possibility that I'd lost my mind, but I am familiar with them and will simply chalk it up to a glitch in reality.
I had just been watching a show that was talking about alternate realities and time travel, and it got me thinking about something that happened to me many years ago. I'm going to take you back to 1967. We moved into this house in Martinez, California on Adelaide Drive. I had some weird stuff happen at this place that to this day still perplexes me. But I'll try and keep this on the subject of my blue steamer trunk that I found in the tool shed of this residence shortly after we moved in. I say my blue steamer trunk because it literally had my name on it, first and last. It was taped on the top center of the trunk with the raised letters plastic label maker tape. I found it while exploring the property and wandered into the tool shed aside from the main house. I go inside and ask my mum and dad if it's something they had hid from me and would be mine soon, or maybe that belonged to my auntie after whom I was named. They both said no, but suggested it could have belonged to a previous tenant, as we were renting the home. So I let it go for a bit, which was odd for me, because I was quite the inquisitive child and had always sought answers to all the mysteries of life. I had no idea if my name was common or not, as I was simply 10. Sometime later, I got friendly with the landlady who lived just one street over, and asked her if someone with my name had ever lived there, and explained about the trunk that should be returned to the rightful owner. But she went on to say that I was the only person with that name ever to live there, and suggested perhaps my parents were just hiding a gift for perhaps my birthday or Christmas. But I knew better. My parents were not the types to think that far ahead about gifts, and I would most likely be the recipient of a last-minute gift from the grocery store or something from a thrift store or hand-me-down. I tried to put it out of my mind for a while, and it worked. Our dad and my older brother Jack had used the shed to store tools and stuff for working on the car, but neither of them ever mentioned seeing this blue steamer trunk that took up a large amount of space for the relatively small shed. I remember that Jack had removed the transmission from his old car and stored it in said shed because of the minimal space. It was practically in the middle of the floor, set next to the trunk that was placed neatly under the workbench. Then one Sunday in late spring, I had a great idea for a slumber party. Remember, this was the time of the hippie protests, and things like sit-ins and even love-ins were all the rage. So I decided to have a bake-in, where me and my chosen list of guests would bring their favorite cookie recipes and bake cookies for fun, entertainment, and of course, the all-important ingredients for a slumber party, snacks. All in all, it went pretty well, although my poor parents had to deal with the loud gaggling of a constant train of young girls trapezing back and forth from the patio and the kitchen and bathroom. Whoever thought to build a 4-bedroom house with only one bathroom never had to deal with a preteen bladder. When it got late, we finished cleaning up the kitchen, though I'm sure the patio was a lot messier. We washed our faces, brushed our teeth, and put our pajamas on, and prepared for lights out at midnight. Of course, we rolled into our sleeping bags and pillows and such to pretend that we were going to sleep. We were so high on sugar that we had no intention of doing just that. We tried to play quietly, but if you can ever find a way to have a pillow fight quietly, I'd like to know how, because we certainly did not succeed. My older sister, who was up and sneaking talking to her boyfriend on the phone, told me that if Mum got up and found her on the phone because of us, that we would regret it for the rest of our lives. As you can imagine, we decided on a quieter game. We got into a circle with me standing in the center as the other girls sat on the floor and were trying to do what is now called light as a feather, stiff as a board. Although I wasn't lying down, I'm not sure what we chanted. It was dark except for the streetlight. I was watching myself in the reflection from the window and saw myself start to rise. It freaked me out, so I looked down at the other girl to see if they were seeing what was happening. Most of them had their eyes closed and were saying something like "rise" in unison. It was then I noticed that Eleanor Nichols had her eyes open, with her jaw gaping. She and I looked at one another and screamed. I promptly fell the 6 inches or so that I had been raised. Everyone had stopped their chant in fright, and my mum popped through the door and yelled that we'd better shut up and go to bed right now. We tried. Well, some girls made it, but Eleanor and I were still too freaked out to sleep. I get up and ruffled through my top dresser drawer, took out a cigarette and matches I had hidden there, and motioned to Eleanor to get up as we tiptoed out the door. We peeked out to see my sister sitting there watching the door. We weren't going to leave that way. The only other way was to climb out the bedroom window and go back around to sneak a smoke. So that's exactly what we did. I took the Salem menthol cigarette, placed it to my lips and struck the match. And as I did so, I saw my little sister coming around the corner of the patio, closest to the back door. She just wanted to share the smoke, but when I said no, I was blackmailed into giving to her some because she was the baby girl, and Mum would believe whatever she wanted to make about me. So I passed it to Eleanor, and she passed it to Sylvia, who of course got hotboxed by it, taking too many drugs. I stomped it out, and thought we'd go back to my room to try to sleep. This is where things get a bit more weird. I thought we went back in the house via the front door where Sylvia came out. Deb, our big sister, wasn't in the hallway, so we got back in the room and our sleeping bags with no issues. However, I awoke just around dawn sleeping on the floor of the tool shed next to the freaking blue steamer trunk that had my name on it. Suddenly the shed door opens, and it's Eleanor and my little sister. They say something like, "You win hide-go-seek. We've been looking for you since last night after the smoke." I just laughed and went along with the idea that I'd hidden there on purpose, but I was perplexed. It's strange, but when you're a kid you can somehow let stuff you can't wrap around your head just go and proceed with whatever comes next. Or maybe it was an aspect of the trunk to mask our thoughts about it. Such weirdness was a part of this time. I tell this short event to help express that many other strange and weird and even borderline outrageous things happened at the house. Not sure if it was just the trunk or the location that was the vortex of weirdness. But anyway, my brother graduated high school, joined the army and was sent off to Vietnam. Our parents started having even more issues than before and I was 12. Things were changing. I finally went into the shed and extracted the trunk. Nobody could tell me how it got there or why my name was on it, but I slowly opened it. It never had a lock on it, but for some reason I never thought to open it, nor had any other member of the family. Who doesn't open something like that? It had been there for nearly 3 years, yet with all of my questions about it, I'd never once as much peeked inside. Let me tell you, my sisters were always going through my stuff. Anyway, this part is a bit confusing. There was a picture of a girl called Yvonne Streeter, although my sister said it was just her friend Debbie Streeter. A few years later, when incarcerated in juvenile hall, I met Yvonne Streeter. Yes, Debbie Streeter's little sister. Debbie and my sister Deb had been friends in school, and I had gotten that picture from Yvonne herself. There was also a picture of a cute chubby baby, a black nightgown, a glass water picture, clear with yellow flowers, and some things that proved to be the objects that would astonish and amaze me. One was a paperback script of the play The Wizard of Oz. It had the initials PJ on it. There was also a library book for the script of the musical The Music Man. The card in the front said the last person to check it out was me, and the return date was July 30th, 1975. Remember, I was 12, and this is 1969, when the trunk was first opened. How many years later, I know how this trunk came to be. It was bought for me by my 26-year-old boyfriend to help me pack up stuff while I ran away to live with him in Green River, Wyoming when I was 16. I was found, returned to California, and incarcerated in Contra Costa County Juvenile Hall, where they used the label maker to put my name on it. Okay, so that happens, but there's more. I was sent to foster care in Oakdale, California. My trunk was lost for a time, but eventually got sent to me in my new home. I buckled down and managed a B average on the last semester of my junior year, as well as throughout my senior year. It was quite fun there, and without my family dogging me, I did pretty well. Senior year, I had chosen to be Glenda the Good in my high school performance of The Wizard of Oz, and I had taken the nickname PJ, as my aunt, for whom I am named, had always called me Peggy, and my middle name is Jean. I later also participated in the high school musical The Music Man, though after graduation I went back to Martinez to live with my mother and stepfather. Not a great move, but it brings me to another object found in the trunk, the library book of the script of the aforementioned musical. The local summer stock was holding auditions for The Music Man. I'd already done this musical, and I thought I'd be sure to get a singing role. I went to our local library and checked out the book. I really didn't get the correlation at the time. Really, how could I have completely missed that? I just went forward, and did not give the trunk that I found as a young girl a single thought. So there was the picture of the cute baby. Now, years before, when I'd first opened it, my mum said that it looked like my baby brother, but it wasn't. This is who it was. And now I can write it down and deal with the weirdness. In 1977, 1 month before my 20th birthday, I gave birth to a 10-pound, 9.5-ounce baby boy. Me and my then husband named the baby Jason Adam Nichols. Oh, my goodness. He was the baby in the picture. Thus the family resemblance to my baby brother. I still don't know how or when the trunk travelled through my own timeline, but I was the one who packed it when I moved out of our house during the separation and eventual divorce from my now ex-husband. This is just some of the weird-ass stuff that happened to me. It is hard for me to even write this out and still perplexes me to this day, but I know that someday I will hopefully completely understand. This happened a while ago. It was a series of odd and strange events that really made me question our stay at this particular establishment. Let me take you back. My boyfriend and I wanted to go to a rural cabin. We were quite excited about it. We were going to Estes Park, Colorado. We left the night before at about 8 and arrived at 10 a.m. When we arrived, we thought it would be best to change our check-in time, as we were there a whole 5 hours early. And after speaking with someone, it was established that we could. Our lodge was about a 15-minute drive up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. The place was family-owned. We arrive at the lodge, and it's empty. And as we're reaching the threshold, I get met by a wave of instant bad vibe. I thought I was overreacting. The place was nice. It had 32 rooms, 2 stories, 16 rooms per floor, split symmetrically on each side. There were 3 cars in the parking lot, which was considerably lower than I expected given the Airbnb ratings and popularity. And when we ring the bell, the owner comes out confused. He says that he had not received a word of an earlier check-in, which was strange, but we try and forget about it. We are ushered to our room, first floor, corner, room 111. I'm into numerology and was quite excited. While all of this was going on though, there was a lady who we expected was behind us in the queue. She just kept watching us in her running clothes. I assumed she was waiting to check in also, but when we were done, she didn't make the slightest inclination to speak to the owner, which definitely gave me a bad feeling. Coupled with the fact that as we were walking to our car to gather our things, she gave me a sly smile. It was really making me feel uneasy, but again, I tried to put it to the back of my mind. As we're walking down the hallway to reach our room, we see a guy behind us with a distinctive eerie aura. My boyfriend and I both see him, and as my boyfriend does a double take to look back, the guy's gone, completely out of sight. Strange, we thought. We swear he had just been there. Perhaps he had gone somewhere where we couldn't see him. Regardless, we go to our room and are met with disappointment. Not only was the beautiful view of nature, as I had expected, been taken from us and replaced with a view of the parking lot, we also had no amenities as promised, and the deadbolt had been removed. The bad vibe that I had had initially was intensifying. Trying to make a bad situation good, we decide to grab some snacks and stuff, make our way to the grocery store, and then hike a trail, where we find a clay-built structure with an old fireplace remains, and a Native American man starts talking to us. Although he was nice and we spoke to him for a good while, he kept asking us where we were staying. We found this odd and didn't want to say it, but after he asked us for the third time, the bad vibe worsened, and we decided to say our goodbyes and get out of there. When we get back to the lodge, the feeling doesn't go away. We were starting to feel uneasy. When we get back to our room, the bad feeling hasn't dissipated. We're just chilling in there when all of a sudden the door starts to shake, as if someone was trying to open it. My boyfriend opens it, and there's a woman there. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was in here." And she panics and runs off. Allegedly, she was trying to test the key, which we find strange. I'd understand it if they did this before check-in, but we had certainly passed the elapsed expected check-in time, so it was getting even more sinister in my mind. But we were trying to brush everything off. After a while, we decide that it'd be best that we look for a new place. And as we're looking, we hear a click. It's coming from the door. My boyfriend reaches his hand out and goes to open it, but it won't open. It's almost like it's locked from the outside. This is the strangest thing. He tries with all his might and he can't open it at all, no luck. At this point, I am now starting to panic. We're locked in our room from the outside, and we are aware that employees can get into our room from inside the lodge. We go outside and try and open it from the porch with no luck. I go to the car and FaceTime my mum to explain what's going on, and that it's very, very creepy. But she wasn't buying it. We had just about hit the creepy limit at this point, and as we start to pack our stuff away, I feel something underneath my feet. There's a rug. My boyfriend pulls it back. It's a hatch. He opens it up and it goes down to the garage space right under our room. At this point, we're done. We get everything back into the car, check out early, and get out of there as quickly as we can. While waiting in the car, it was the longest 5 minutes of my life waiting for him to return. Everything about that place was super sketchy. The bad vibe, the weird woman, the disappearing people, being locked in with no explanation. I really wasn't feeling it. I think there was something off about that place. I was sitting in my psychology class with my friend Ben one day. We were handing in our assignment to the teacher so that she could mark it and give it back to us with feedback the next day. Both Ben and I and our teacher remember the following events happening. Ben put his homework in one of those plastic pockets and placed them on the table in front of the teacher. Then our teacher took it and placed it in her binder. The next day she handed back everyone's homework except for Ben's. Ben asked her if she'd marked his, and she looked at him weird and said that she did, and distinctly remembered marking Ben's work as he was one of the smartest in our class, and she always remembered marking his. She looked in her folder again, flipping through each page but couldn't find it. She was starting to think she left it at home by accident when Ben opened his book to find his homework unmarked and in the same spot it was in yesterday before he'd handed it in. All three of us were absolutely confused. We all remember and saw him hand it in, and our teacher even remembered marking it. Me and Ben even knew exactly where he placed his homework on the table. In fact, to this day I can still remember these events so clearly, and I have zero explanation for how his work ended up back in his book.